She was 8 months pregnant when she found another woman's heels beside her staircase. Not a stranger's, not a guest's. A woman who had been sleeping in Seraphina's bed, wearing Seraphina's space, breathing her air for weeks. Dante Calloway, the man who made grown men tremble with a single phone call, had not just cheated. He had replaced her, while she carried his child. He moved his mistress into their home, into her closet, onto her vanity, into her life. And when Seraphina stood in that doorway, one hand over her unborn daughter, she didn't scream. She didn't beg. She took off her wedding ring, set it on the table, and walked out. But here's what Dante didn't know yet. The woman leaving his mansion held something far more dangerous than a broken heart. She held the truth that could burn his entire empire to the ground. If this story hits you somewhere deep, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel and follow every part of Seraphina's story to the very end. You won't want to miss what comes next. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The rain came down hard that Tuesday night, the kind of Boston rain that doesn't apologize for itself. It hit the windows of the Calloway estate in long, rattling sheets, and the whole house smelled like wet stone and something else, something Seraphina couldn't name at first, standing in the front doorway with her coat still dripping. Perfume, not hers. She stood still for a moment, one hand braced against the doorframe, the other instinctively dropping to her belly. 8 months. 8 months the baby had been restless all day, shifting and pressing against her ribs like she already understood. Something was wrong. Seraphina had always been practical about pain. You feel it, you assess it, you decide what to do next. She learned that early, growing up with a mother who called tears indulgent, and a father who disappeared before she turned 10. You don't stand in doorways, feeling sorry for yourself. You move. She moved. The front hall was quiet, except for the rain. Dante's men weren't posted at the door, which was unusual. They were always somewhere at the gate, near the kitchen, ghosts in expensive suits, pretending to be invisible. Tonight the house felt oddly emptied out, like someone had cleared the stage before a performance. The red peonies were the second thing she noticed. She had arranged white lilies herself 6 days ago. She remembered because the florist had called 3 times to confirm the order, and she'd been in the middle of a client call each time. White lilies, always white lilies in the front hall. It was a small thing, her thing, one of the few corners of this enormous house she had made genuinely hers. The peonies were red, expensive, professionally arranged in a vase she didn't recognize. Seraphina looked at them for a long moment. Then she looked down the hallway toward the kitchen, and then up the staircase. The heels were at the bottom of the stairs. They were the kind of shoes women bought when they wanted to be noticed: deep red, high stiletto, the sort of heel that was less practical footwear and more of a statement. Designer, not cheap. Seraphina knew exactly what they cost because she'd been offered a similar pair at a charity event once and declined on principle. She didn't like shoes that announced themselves before she walked into the room. She stood there, looking at those shoes, and the baby kicked. Heart. I know, Seraphina said quietly, to herself, to the child, to no one in particular. She heard laughter from upstairs. It was a woman's laugh, light, unguarded, the kind of laugh you make when you feel completely at home somewhere. When you aren't worried about being overheard. When you have no reason to be quiet. Seraphina's hand tightened on the stair railing. She climbed slowly. Not because she was afraid. Because she was 8 months pregnant, and her lower back had been aching since noon, and because some part of her was still trying to construct a reasonable explanation. A visiting relative. A friend Dante hadn't mentioned. A business associate with questionable taste in footwear. Her mind kept trying to give her something to hold on to. By the time she reached the second-floor landing, her mind had stopped trying. The bedroom door was half open. She could see the room through the gap, the soft lamplight, the edge of her bed. And Arabella Voss, wearing a silk robe that was not Seraphina's, lying across the sheets like she'd been there for years. Seraphina knew who she was. Dante's world was not large, and Arabella was not exactly subtle. She ran a gallery on Newbury Street, the kind of gallery where the art was secondary to who attended the openings. She was 31. Beautiful in the particular way of women who have built their appearance like a career. And she had been looking at Dante at every social function for the past 2 years, with the patience of someone who knew eventually the timing would work in her favor. Apparently it had. Seraphina pushed the door open all the way. Arabella looked up from her phone. For 1/2 second, something flickered across her face, not guilt exactly, more like the brief recalibration of a person caught in a situation they'd prepared for, but hadn't quite expected to arrive this way. Then she recovered. She actually tilted her chin up slightly, like a woman who has decided that confidence is the best offense. "Seraphina," she said. "Not sorry. Not embarrassed. Just acknowledging." Seraphina looked at the woman on her bed. Then she looked at her closet. The door was open, and she could see it immediately. Dresses and blouses crowded in beside her own clothes, the hangers slightly misaligned from being added too quickly. A row of shoes she didn't own. A Louis Vuitton duffel bag sitting open on the floor of her closet like it lived there. She looked at the vanity. Foundation, lip color, a perfume bottle, a jewelry case, none of it hers. All of it settled in amongst her own things with the comfortable permanence of objects that had claimed their space. Arabella hadn't visited. She'd moved in. Seraphina felt something happen inside her chest. Not the sharp crack of heartbreak she might have expected. Something quieter and more total, the sensation of something she had believed in for years simply becoming false. Like a mathematical proof you'd trusted completely, and then someone points to a flaw in line 3, and suddenly the whole elegant structure doesn't hold. She reached into her coat pocket. Her wedding ring was on her right hand. She'd moved it there 2 months ago, when her left hand started swelling. She worked it off carefully, which took a moment because her fingers were still cold from the rain and slightly swollen. She held it in her palm for a second. Platinum band, single diamond, Dante's grandmother's setting. She'd loved it once. She heard footsteps in the hallway behind her. Dante. She knew his walk the way you know the sound of your own heartbeat. 10 years of marriage makes you fluent in a person's physical presence without thinking about it. He stopped in the doorway. She didn't turn around immediately. She set the ring on the corner of her vanity table, the one section still entirely her own, though for how much longer she couldn't say. Then she turned. Dante Calloway was 53 years old and had the kind of face that had never fully decided between handsome and intimidating, strong jaw, dark eyes, the sort of effortless physical authority that made rooms rearrange themselves around him, without anyone consciously deciding to do it. She had watched him make hardened men go pale with a single measured look. She had watched him negotiate with people who had every reason to want him dead, completely unbothered. He was bothered now. He stood in the doorway with his suit jacket in his hand, not quite looking at her and not quite looking away, and for the first time in years she saw something in his face that she recognized as genuine fear. Not the controlled strategic alertness he wore during difficult negotiations. Real fear. Kind a person feels when they understand that they have broken something irreversible. Good, she thought, and hated herself a little for thinking it. "Sarah, don't." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Just don't start with my name like that." He closed his mouth. She looked at him for a long moment. The man she married. The man who had knelt beside her on a rainy night 12 years ago in a parking garage of all places, producing a ring he'd clearly been carrying for weeks and choosing the most impractical possible moment to produce it, which she had found then deeply charming. The man who called her 3 times the day she miscarried their first pregnancy, not to fix anything, just to be present through the phone because he was in London and couldn't get back in time, and he'd sounded more undone than she'd ever heard him. She looked at the man who had moved his girlfriend into her bedroom while she was 8 months pregnant with his child. "How long has she been living here?" Seraphina asked. Silence. Dante still steady. She was proud of that, in a distant way. "How long?" 6 weeks, Arabella said from the bed. Seraphina didn't look at her. She kept her eyes on Dante. He said nothing, which was, she understood, its own answer. Six weeks. She had been going to her prenatal appointments alone. Dante was always busy, always something. She had stopped asking him to come months ago because the asking itself had become humiliating. She had been managing the Calloway financial accounts from her own office, driving herself to the hospital for checkups, eating dinners by herself in the kitchen of this enormous house while Dante was at meetings, and for 6 of those weeks, another woman had been sleeping in her bed. "You chose," Seraphina said. "That's what you did." "You chose, not." He started. "It's not what?" She felt something rise in her chest. Not tears, not rage, exactly more like the specific exhaustion of a person who has been very patient for a very long time and has simply reached the end of it. "It's not what it looks like? Her clothes are in my closet, Dante. Her shoes are at the bottom of my staircase. Her perfume is in my house, and her vase is in my hall, and she is lying on my bed in my room, and you were going to what? Tell me this isn't what it looks like?" He didn't answer, which was the most honest thing he'd done in months. Seraphina picked up her bag from where she'd set it on the floor. She hadn't even taken her coat off. Sidnin ina. She realized that distantly she was still wearing her coat, still damp from the rain, her hair still darkened at the edges from where the hood hadn't quite covered it. "You chose your mistress," she said. "Now choose what kind of man you want to be without me." She walked to the door. He stepped back to let her through, which she found interesting even now. Even in this, Dante Calloway didn't try to physically stop her. Whatever else he was, he had always understood that particular line. She went down the stairs, past the red peonies, past the expensive shoes at the bottom of the staircase, out the front door and into the rain. She sat in her car for 4 minutes before she started the engine. Not crying, just sitting. The baby moved again, a slow, rolling shift that pressed against her lower ribs, and Seraphina put her hand on her belly and breathed. "We're okay," she said. "We're going to be okay." She wasn't certain it was true, but she said it anyway. Seraphina had built Whitlock Financial from nothing, quite literally nothing, meaning a second-hand desk in a shared workspace on Boylston Street, 2 clients who were friends of friends, and a business plan she'd revised 17 times before she showed it to anyone. That was 11 years ago. Now, Whitlock Financial occupied a full floor of a building in the Back Bay with 12 employees, a client list that included legitimate hedge funds, real estate developers, and several nonprofit endowments, and a reputation for the kind of financial analysis that made institutions trust her with the things they were actually worried about. It also, for the past 7 years, had managed the legitimate business interests of the Calloway organization. Seraphina was not naive about what the Calloways were. She hadn't married into that world accidentally or innocently. She knew what Dante was when she chose him, and she had made a series of very deliberate decisions about what she would and wouldn't touch, what she would analyze and what she would walk away from. She had drawn lines. She had kept them. And she had been good enough at her work that Dante's legitimate holdings, the real estate, the harbor development projects, the hospitality businesses had grown substantially under her management. She returned to the office the morning after she left the mansion. Her assistant Marcus was already there when she arrived at 7:15, and he took one look at her and said, "Coffee." "Full pot, don't argue." She didn't argue. She sat at her desk and stared at her computer screen for 45 minutes before she could make herself look at the Blackwater Harbor files. She'd been warning Dante about this project for 8 months. Blackwater Harbor was a massive waterfront development on the eastern edge of Boston, mixed-use commercial and residential, $240 million in projected value, and carrying a debt structure so unstable that Seraphina had put the risk assessment in writing 3 separate times. The financing was over-leveraged. The timeline was unrealistic. The key investors had liability exposure that hadn't been properly disclosed. It was, in her professional judgment, a slow-motion catastrophe, waiting for the right pressure to start collapsing. Dante had not listened. The project was Victor Calloway's priority, Dante's father, the actual architect of the Calloway empire, a man who had been running organized crime in Boston since before Seraphina was born, and who did not appreciate being told his business decisions were structurally unsound. When Seraphina's concerns reached Victor through Dante, the response had come back through Dante as well, The project would proceed. Her concerns were noted and dismissed. She had noted the dismissal in writing, too. Sitting at her desk that morning, she pulled up the current status reports and understood immediately that the situation had progressed from serious to critical. Debt service payments were overdue. Two of the major institutional lenders had sent default notices. The construction timeline was 7 months behind, and the estimated shortfall, the gap between what the project needed and what it actually had, was now somewhere north of $60 million. Her phone rang. Dante. She let it go to voicemail. It rang again 20 minutes later. She let it go again. The third time she answered. I need to talk to you, Dante said. No greeting, no acknowledgement of the night before. I don't think we have anything to say to each other right now. Seraphina, don't. Please don't do the thing where you say my name like that and expect it to open a door. That door is closed. A pause. She could hear him breathing on the other end, which meant he was somewhere alone when Dante was around people. Even people he controlled completely, he was always slightly more contained. This breathing was the unguarded version. Arabella. Dante. Her voice didn't rise. It dropped, actually, into something quieter and more final. If the next word out of your mouth is any kind of explanation for Arabella, I'm going to hang up, and you won't reach me again today. Silence. What do you want? She asked. I want you to come back. I know you do. She looked out the window at the gray Boston morning. That's not going to happen. Another silence. Then, in a different register, less husband, more business, the Blackwater situation is getting worse. I know. I'm looking at it right now. I need you to... No. You don't know what I was going to say. You were going to ask me to help stabilize the financing. Run some analysis that makes it look better than it is. Buy you more time with the lenders. Help Victor find a way to restructure without triggering the default clauses. She paused. Did I miss anything? He was quiet for a moment. The investors. The investors trusted those projections because I was attached to this firm's reputation. I am not going to use that reputation to paper over a project that is failing because you ignored every warning I gave you. She closed the Blackwater file on her screen. I told you 8 months ago, Dante. I told you 6 months ago. I told you in April, and I told you in June, and I put it in writing every single time. You didn't listen. I was dealing with other things. Yes, she said. I know what you were dealing with. She hung up. He showed up at her office 4 days later. She heard him before she saw him, or rather, she heard her assistant saying something sharp and the low, controlled response that meant Dante was being polite about not accepting no for an answer. She was on a call with a client in Phoenix, so by the time she ended it and came to the doorway of her office, Dante was already in the waiting area, sitting in one of the chairs that wasn't quite big enough for him, looking thoroughly out of place in the deliberately understated reception space she'd designed specifically to signal that this was a serious professional environment. Give us a few minutes, she told Marcus. He raised his eyebrows at her in a way that meant, Are you sure? And she nodded. The door closed. Dante stood up. He looked not like himself, she thought. He'd shaved recently, but not very well. His suit was correct, but his tie was slightly off-center, which was the kind of small disorder that wouldn't register to anyone who didn't know him well. She knew him well. You looked tired. Thank you, he said, which was not what she expected. She sat on the edge of her assistant's desk and crossed her arms, not as a defense gesture exactly, but because she needed to do something with her hands and didn't want him to see them tremble. Arabella is still at the house, he said. That's your business. I want her to leave. Also your business. He looked at her. You're not going to make this easy, are you, Dante? She kept her voice even. You moved a woman into our home while I was carrying your child. I found out standing in my own doorway. I smelled her perfume before I saw the shoes. She paused. Tell me what version of easy you feel entitled to here. He didn't answer. He looked at his hands for a moment, which was very unlike him. Dante Calloway was not a man who looked at his hands. It was a mistake, he said finally. I already explained to you, in detail, why 6 weeks of active deception is not a mistake. I know. He met her eyes. I know that. For a moment, the room held something that wasn't quite silence, more like the negative space around a lot of things that weren't being said. Seraphina knew this man. She had loved him, genuinely and completely, for most of a decade. She remembered what it felt like to trust him without reservation, before the slow erosion started, the missed appointments, the closed doors, the conversations that used to happen, and then didn't. She also remembered standing in that doorway with one hand on her belly and another woman's perfume in the air. The Blackwater situation, Dante said. I need 60 days. No. Seraphina, how long do you actually have? She asked. A pause. 60 days. She looked at him. I wasn't asking rhetorically. He exhaled. 60 days before the default clauses activate across the major lenders. And Victor? Something changed in his face. A slight tightening around the jaw. Victor is handling it. Victor is why it's a catastrophe, she said. Victor pushed a $200 million project on a financing structure I told you was unsound. And when I said that his response was to tell you that my concerns were an inconvenience. She stood up from the desk. I am not going to be the person who saves Victor Calloway's mistakes. I'm done being the person who holds this organization together while being treated as something it owns. Dante stood very still. In the old days not so long ago, really that particular tone in his eyes, that controlled quiet, would have felt like safety to her. Now it felt like distance. 60 days, he said again. She walked to her office door and held it open. 60 days, Dante. And then Blackwater Harbor falls. He left without saying anything else. She closed the door behind him, walked to her desk, sat down, and put her head in her hands for 90 seconds. Not crying, just being very tired for 90 seconds, which she felt she had earned. Then she sat up, opened her computer, and went back to work. That was how things stood on the evening of the Harrington Gala. The Harrington was one of those Boston charities that existed primarily as a place where money met money and shook hands with itself. Seraphina attended every year because several of her clients expected her presence, and because she had learned long ago that being visible in these spaces was part of what kept her firm credible. She attended this year, despite being significantly pregnant, and despite having spent the previous 2 weeks being called, emailed, and once physically stopped outside a restaurant by various people associated with the Calloway organization, asking her, with varying degrees of politeness, to reconsider her position on Blackwater Harbor. She wore a midnight blue dress that accommodated her belly without apologizing for it, and she arrived alone. Adrian Blackridge found her near the back of the main hall, which was where she'd strategically positioned herself near an exit within easy reach of the water service, far enough from the main social current that she could hold actual conversations instead of performing them. She'd known Adrian professionally for 3 years. He was Dante's most powerful business rival in Boston's real estate and development space. This was not on the criminal side, which was Dante's inheritance, but on the legitimate institutional side, which was where Dante had been trying to establish himself. Adrian ran Blackridge Development with the kind of methodical precision that made other developers uncomfortable because he had a habit of doing exactly what he said he would do exactly when he said he would do it, which, in their industry, was disorienting. They had talked at perhaps 6 or 7 events, always about business, always analytically, the kind of conversation Seraphina found genuinely energizing, where she could say something technically complicated without having to first explain why a woman with a financial advisory firm might understand something technically complicated. You look like you're planning an escape route, Adrian said. I'm always planning an escape route, she said. It's a professional skill. He handed her a glass of sparkling water, which she accepted. He raised his own glass actual champagne, which she noted without judgment. He was 38 and looked somewhat older, not because he appeared worn down, but because his face had the quality of someone who had made a lot of consequential decisions and accepted the weight of them. A thin scar above his left eyebrow that she'd never asked about. I heard about Blackwater Harbor, he said. She looked at him. Not from anyone inside, he said quickly. The lender notices are becoming harder to keep quiet. There's talk. There's always talk. This is specific talk. He looked at his glass for a moment. Are you okay? The question caught her off balance, not because it was intrusive, but because nobody had asked her that in a while. She'd gotten a lot of, how is the firm handling this? And what's your position on the restructuring? And Dante needs you to reconsider. Nobody had asked how she was. "I've been better," she said honestly. "I know, I'm sorry." She looked at him sideways. "What do you know exactly?" "Enough." He was quiet for a moment. "I also know that you warned Calloway about the project. I know you put it in writing. And I know that you have been running his legitimate holdings for 7 years, and that his empire looks dramatically different because of that, and that you're about to have your name attached to a disaster you tried to prevent." He paused. "That's what I know." She said nothing for a moment. "I have a property in Cambridge," he said. "Clean title, professionally managed, very quiet neighborhood. If you need a place to have some space, think, whatever you need it for." He met her eyes. "No conditions, no expectations, just in case you need somewhere that isn't connected to the Calloways." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked out at the room, at the assembled wealth and influence of Boston, at the people she recognized and the ones who recognized her, at the particular loneliness of being surrounded by a world that considered itself her world while treating her like a satellite of someone else's planet. "I'll think about it," she said. That was when Dante appeared across the room. He was looking directly at her. He moved through the crowd the way he always moved, with a consistency of pace and direction that made people shift slightly without knowing they were doing it, an automatic physical authority that was just part of how he existed in space. Arabella was not with him, she noticed. He was alone. He stopped a few feet away and looked at Adrian for a long moment, and Adrian looked back with the equanimity of a man who had dealt with worse, and then Dante looked at Seraphina. "We need to talk," he said. "Now's not a great time," she said. "Seraphina." He kept his voice low, which in a room full of people meant it wasn't quite private. "It's about Blackwater, tonight. 60 days, she said. 43, he said. She looked at him. 3 of the lenders moved their default notices up. "The deadline's not 60 days anymore, it's 43. His jaw was tight. "I need to know what you're going to do." She turned fully to face him. Around them, the party continued its carefully orchestrated social performance, entirely indifferent to the fact that right here, in this pocket of still air, something was ending. "I'm not going to protect Blackwater Harbor," she said. "I told you that. The investors are adults who sign documents. The documents are accurate. The projections you showed them were not." She kept her voice level. "If the project fails, that's the consequence of decisions that were made against my explicit written advice." "And my family?" he asked. Something crossed his face when he said it, not manipulation. She didn't think, but something almost involuntary. A genuine question from somewhere underneath the Mafia Boss. "You chose your family, Dante. You chose it over and over again. Every time you treated Victor's judgment as more important than mine. Every time you let him make decisions that I told you were unsound." She picked up her water glass. "I hope it was worth it." She walked away. In the car, heading home, her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. She almost ignored it. Something made her open it instead. The message was from a forensic investigator named Leora Strand. 3 lines, Mrs. Calloway. "We need to speak. I have a document that carries your signature. You may want to know about it before anyone else does." Attached was a photograph. Seraphina enlarged it on her screen, squinting at it in the dim light of the car. It was a financial opinion letter, her firm's letterhead, her signature at the bottom, her professional certification stamp above it. A formal endorsement of the financial soundness of Blackwater Harbor, dated 4 months ago. She had never written that letter. She had never signed it. She stared at her own name at the bottom of the document for a long time as the car moved through the rain-slicked Boston streets, and something cold settled into the space between her shoulder blades that had nothing to do with the weather. 43 days until default. A document she hadn't signed, bearing her name. Her unborn daughter pressed against her ribs, restless and urgent, as if she already knew. Seraphina put the phone in her bag, looked out the window at the passing city, and understood that what she had believed was the worst thing that could happen to her, a cheating husband, a broken marriage, a pregnancy navigated alone, was not even close to the worst thing. The worst thing was still coming. Leora Strand agreed to meet the following morning at a coffee shop in Somerville, her choice, not Seraphina's, which told Seraphina something immediately about the kind of person she was dealing with. Somerville was not Calloway territory. It was deliberately, almost pointedly, ordinary. The kind of neighborhood where nobody wore a suit, unironically, and the coffee was strong and came in paper cups without apology. Seraphina arrived 7 minutes early. She ordered tea because her stomach had been wrong since the night before, something low and grinding that she recognized as stress rather than the pregnancy, and she sat in a corner booth where she could see both the doors and the street outside it. Leora came in at exactly the time she'd said, mid-40s, sturdy, with the kind of face that had made peace with being unreadable. She carried a briefcase that was old enough to have earned its scuffs. She looked at Seraphina across the room, walked directly to the booth, and sat down without ordering anything. "You've seen the document," Leora said. "The photograph of it." "Yes, I have the original." Leora set her briefcase on the seat beside her, but didn't open it. "Or rather, I have a certified copy of what was submitted to the lenders. The original went into a financing package for Blackwater Harbor 4 months ago." Seraphina kept her hands flat on the table. "Tell me exactly what it is." "Financial opinion letter, your firm's letterhead, your credentials listed, your signature and your certification stamp at the bottom." Leora looked at her steadily. "It represents Whitlock Financial as having independently reviewed the Blackwater Harbor projections and found them to be financially sound and accurately disclosed to investors." "That letter does not exist," Seraphina said. "I never wrote it. I never authorized it. I never signed it. I know. You know. Your emergency complaint to the financial regulators, filed 11 days ago. I'm aware of it. And the dates don't line up with any of your client records, your billing records, or the access logs from your internal systems." Leora paused. "Whoever created that document did it carefully, but not carefully enough." Seraphina looked at her. "How did you get involved in this?" Leora was quiet for a moment. "I was retained to investigate discrepancies in the Blackwater Harbor financing documentation. By a party I'm not at liberty to name. What I found was more than discrepancies." "Who retained you?" "I can't answer that. Can't or won't." "Both." Leora opened her briefcase and removed a folder. She pushed it across the table without opening it. "What I can tell you is that this is everything I have. Certified copies. Chain of custody is documented." She met Seraphina's eyes. "And I can tell you that whoever signed your name to that document was very deliberate about the timing. It went into the financing package at the exact moment the project was about to lose one of its anchor investors. That letter kept the project alive for 4 months." Seraphina stared at the folder. 4 months ago," she said slowly. "That was March." "Yes. That was 3 months before the default notices started." "Yes." She looked up. "If I hadn't filed that emergency complaint, you would have been the most visible responsible party when the project collapsed." Leora said it flatly, without drama. "Just information being transferred. Your name is on the letter. Your credentials, your firm. The investors trusted that representation. When Blackwater goes under, and it is going under, the question of who told them it was sound becomes very significant, very quickly." Seraphina sat with that for a moment. Outside, a truck rumbled past on the street. Somebody at the counter laughed at something the barista said. Normal morning, normal world, completely indifferent to the fact that someone had very carefully constructed a professional and legal trap around her and set it to spring at a moment of maximum damage. "I need to know who ordered the forgery," she said. "That's the question," Leora agreed. "Do you have an answer?" A pause. "I have a trail. Whether it leads where it looks like it leads, that's for you to decide." Seraphina opened the folder. She was back in her office by 10 o'clock. She sat at her desk and went through the folder piece by piece, slowly, the way she always worked, not looking for confirmation of what she suspected, but looking for what was actually there. It was a habit she'd built deliberately over years, because confirmation bias was the most expensive mistake a financial analyst could make. The access logs were the thing that stopped her. Her firm used a proprietary financial modeling system she'd had it built 6 years ago, specifically calibrated to her analytical methodology. It was not off-the-shelf software. It produced outputs in a format that was recognizably hers, The kind of thing that would be very difficult to convincingly replicate without access to the underlying models. The access logs showed that someone had gotten into the system. Not recently, not after the financing package was submitted. For 11 weeks, before the forged letter appeared in the Blackwater Harbor documentation. The access had been brief 47 minutes in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. Files accessed, 3 of them. Files exported, 2. Then out. Clean, quick, targeted. The kind of access that doesn't look like a hack because it used legitimate credentials. An authorized user's login, someone who had been given access at some point for a legitimate reason and had apparently retained that access longer than they should have. Seraphina went through the list of users who had ever been granted access to the system. She reached a name and stopped. Martin Greaves. She sat back in her chair. Martin Greaves was 61 years old and had been a senior administrator in the Calloway organization's financial operations for more than 2 decades. He was not, technically, her employee. He worked for the Calloway family's internal structure, but 7 years ago, when she'd first taken over management of the legitimate holdings, there had been a brief transition period during which Greaves had been given access to her modeling system to facilitate the handover of financial records. That access should have been revoked after 90 days. It had not been revoked. She'd never checked. That was on her. In the chaos of integrating 7 years' worth of someone else's financial mismanagement into her own systems, she had given temporary access to a man she barely knew and then simply never followed up on removing it. And 11 weeks before a forged letter bearing her name appeared in a major financing package, Martin Greaves had accessed her proprietary financial models, exported 2 files, and left no trace that was visible unless you were specifically looking for it in an audit log. She picked up her phone. She put it back down. She needed to think before she made any calls, because the next few calls she made were going to matter enormously, and she could not afford to make them in the wrong order or to the wrong people. She thought about Victor Calloway. Victor was 71 years old and had been at the center of the Calloway organization since long before Dante inherited the nominal leadership. Dante was the face, but Victor was the architecture. He had built the structures, established the relationships, made the foundational decisions about which to cross and which to hold, and he had done it with the cold patience of a man who had never once been forced to reckon with the consequence he hadn't anticipated first. What she was looking at suggested that Victor had used her name, her reputation, her professional credentials to extend the life of a failing project that he had pushed against her explicit advice. Used her as a shield, used the trust that her name carried in Boston's financial community to buy 4 months of additional runway for something she had told them was going to fail. She thought about what Dante had said at the gala. And my family? She thought about the fact that Dante had been distant and strange since at least April. 6 weeks of Arabella living in her house that started approximately when? March. April at the latest. The same window as the forged letter. She thought very carefully about the possibility that these things were connected. Then she thought about her daughter, who was moving around right now in the unhurried, oceanic way she had, like a creature who had no opinion about any of this and simply intended to be born regardless. Okay, Seraphina said to the empty office. Okay. She picked up the phone and called the number for the Financial Regulatory Authority's Fraud Investigation Unit. Victor called her at 3 in the afternoon. She had been expecting the call, but not quite this, quickly, which meant someone was watching her office, which she'd also half expected, but still felt like a cold hand on the back of her neck when she thought about it directly. Seraphina. Victor's voice on the phone was the same as Victor's voice in person, measured, unhurried, with the specific confidence of a man who had spent decades being the most powerful person in whatever room he entered. I understand you filed a complaint this morning. I filed a complaint 11 days ago, she said. This morning I provided additional documentation. I see. A pause. I'd like to talk about that. I imagine you would. Not on the phone. Also something I'd imagined. She looked at her computer screen. She'd been reviewing access logs for the past 2 hours, and her eyes ached from it. Where my office? 6 o'clock, she almost said no. She considered the angles of it for approximately 4 seconds and then said, "Fine." She told Marcus she had a meeting at 6 and to tell no one where she was going. Then she texted the address to Adrian, along with the words, "If I don't check in by 8, this is where I was." She wasn't being dramatic. She was being precise. He texted back within 2 minutes, understood. "I'll have someone nearby." She stared at that for a moment. "I'll have someone nearby. Not be careful or call me if you need anything." Immediate, practical, calibrated. She put the phone in her bag and went back to the access logs. Victor Calloway's office was in a building on Commonwealth Avenue that he owned outright, had owned for 30 years, and which housed several layers of legitimate business activity above the floors where the actual decisions were made. Seraphina had been here perhaps 15 times over the years. She had always felt the weight of it, not fear exactly, but the specific awareness of being in a place where the rules were Victor's rules, and the exits were permitted rather than guaranteed. Victor was behind his desk when she was shown in. He didn't stand when she entered, which was new. He had always stood before an old-world courtesy that she'd never quite trusted, but had always noted. He was not standing now. That told her something. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He looked at her for a moment, a long, assessing look, the kind he probably gave people before he made decisions about them. She held his gaze without difficulty. She was 8 months pregnant and exhausted, and she had spent the morning looking at evidence that he had committed fraud using her name, and she was genuinely past the point of finding Victor Calloway's gaze intimidating. "You filed a complaint with the regulatory authority," he said. "Yes, characterizing a document as forged. It was forged." "That's a serious accusation. It's a serious crime," she said. "Someone forged my signature on a financial opinion letter and used it to deceive investors in a project that is currently in default. I have the access logs, the timeline, and a certified copy of the forged document. That's not a characterization, Victor. That's documentation." He folded his hands on the desk. He was still a physically impressive man, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, with the kind of face that made younger men nervous. She noticed that his hands were completely still, which meant he was working very hard at something. "You should withdraw the complaint," he said. "I'm not going to do that." "Seraphina." He said her name the way Dante said her name, like it was a door he expected to be able to open. "Think about what you're doing. Blackwater Harbor is a complicated situation. There were accounting irregularities, internal miscommunications. When a project of that scale encounters difficulties, paperwork sometimes. Victor," she kept her voice absolutely level, "don't." He stopped. "I know what I'm looking at," she said. "I have been reading financial documents for 20 years. I know what a genuine accounting irregularity looks like, and I know what a deliberate fraud looks like. That document is a deliberate fraud. My signature is on it. I didn't sign it." He looked at her for a long moment. "Withdraw the complaint," he said again. "We'll handle the Blackwater situation internally. You'll be compensated for any disruption to your firm. And the matter will be resolved without your name being attached to an investigation that could become very complicated for everyone involved." "Including me," she said. "Including you," he nodded slowly. "We can be very specific about where the responsibility for certain decisions lands. If you cooperate, that responsibility doesn't land on you. If you don't," he let it sit there unfinished, which was a technique she recognized. Dante had learned it from him. Leave the threat implied, because an implied threat can be more precisely shaped than a stated one. "If I don't," she said, "you'll tell investigators that I signed the letter willingly, that I knew about the fraud, that I was a participant." He said nothing. "Is that accurate?" she asked. He said nothing. She looked at him and felt something crystallize inside her, not anger, not fear, but a very clean and very cold kind of clarity. "I want to know who ordered the forgery," she said. "I want the name. I'll give you 24 hours. Victor's expression didn't change. "That's not a conversation we're having." 24 hours, she said again, and stood up. She walked to the door. She was almost there when he spoke behind her. "You should think very carefully," he said, "about what this investigation means for Dante." She stopped with her hand on the door. Her back was to him. "Dante," she said, "is not my concern anymore." She walked out. She checked in with Adrian from the car at 7:45. He called back immediately. How was it? Productive. She looked out the window. The city was dark and wet again, a different kind of rain from the night she'd left the mansion lighter, more persistent, the kind that doesn't announce itself. He threatened to implicate me if I don't withdraw the complaint. Silence on the line. Can he make that stick? Adrian asked. He can try. He has resources I don't have, and connections in places that matter. She rubbed the back of her neck. But I have documentation that I filed the complaint before any of this became public. I have the access logs, and now I need the identity of whoever actually ordered the forgery. What are you going to do? Investigate, she said. What else? Martin Greaves was not a man who had expected to be contacted by Seraphina Whitlock directly. She could tell that immediately when he answered the phone, the half-second of silence, before he said hello, the quality of his voice, too controlled too quickly. A man trying to settle himself from the inside out. Mr. Greaves, she said, this is Seraphina Whitlock. I think you know why I'm calling. A pause. I'm not sure I do. I have the access logs from my financial modeling system, she said. March 14th. 2 years ago, I gave you temporary access during the handover period. That access was never revoked. 11 weeks before a document bearing my forged signature appeared in the Blackwater Harbor financing package, you used that access to download 2 of my proprietary model files. She paused. I'm not asking whether you did it. I'm asking who told you to. A long silence, Mr. Greaves. She kept her voice steady. You are going to be questioned by federal investigators. Probably within the next 2 weeks, possibly sooner. At that point, you'll have choices to make about how you want this to go for you. I'd suggest you think carefully about those choices now, while you still have the option to shape them. She heard him breathing on the other end of the line. Short, not quite even. I want you to understand something, she said. I am 8 months pregnant. I had nothing to do with any fraud involving Blackwater Harbor. I tried to prevent this project from happening. I documented my objections in writing. And someone used my name anyway. Her voice didn't break. I am going to find out who gave that order, Mr. Greaves. I'm going to find out with or without your help. But your decision about whether to cooperate will matter enormously to how this ends for you. She let that land. Then she said, think about it. You have my number. She hung up. She sat in the parking garage for a moment. She'd stopped there because she didn't trust herself to drive and have this conversation simultaneously. A small practical concession to the reality of being very pregnant and very stressed in a moving vehicle. Her phone rang. Dante, she answered. I know about Victor's meeting with you, he said immediately. Good. Seraphina, I need you to listen to me. You have about 90 seconds before I decide I'm too tired for this conversation. So say the important thing first. She heard him exhale. I found out about the forged document 3 weeks ago. She was quiet. I found out because I was looking into the Blackwater financials myself, trying to understand why the numbers kept shifting after your last analysis. I found the letter. I recognized that the signature wasn't right. The spacing was wrong. A pause. You always sign your full name with the capital W larger than everything else. It's a quirk. Whoever forged it didn't know that. She closed her eyes. 3 weeks ago, she said, and you didn't tell me. I was trying to find out who 3 weeks ago. Her voice came out very quiet. I was already out of the house. I was already filing complaints. I was already being threatened. And you had information 3 weeks ago that directly affected me, and you didn't call. I was trying to protect you, Dante. She opened her eyes. The parking garage was gray and dim and smelled like exhaust. Do you hear yourself? You were trying to protect me by not telling me that my professional reputation was being used to commit fraud? That is not protection. That is you making a decision about what I should know, again, without asking me what I needed. A silence. Who ordered it? She asked. I don't know. You have a suspicion, a longer silence. Yes, tell me. Seraphina, tell me, Dante. She heard him breathe. Then, it would have to have been someone with access to the financing structure. Someone who knew the project was failing and had the authority to bring in a document that would stabilize investor confidence. He stopped. Someone who knew your reputation, would carry weight with the institutional lenders. Someone with all of that authority, she said. In the Calloway organization. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. I met with your father tonight, she said. I know. He told me to withdraw my complaint. He told me that if I didn't, responsibility for certain decisions would land on me. Seraphina? Is that what this is? Victor used my name, and now he's going to use my name again, this time to bury whatever comes out of this investigation. I won't let him do that. She felt a short, sharp laugh leave her before she could stop it. Not a happy sound. You won't let him. She looked at the concrete wall in front of her. Dante, your father has spent 40 years building an organization where what he decides is what happens. You have spent the last decade technically running it while actually managing his expectations. You found a forged document with my name on it 3 weeks ago, and you didn't tell me because you were afraid of what it meant. She paused. Don't tell me you won't let him. Silence. I'm not trying to hurt you, she said. I'm telling you what's true. I know it's true, he said. And something in his voice, just then, something raw and unguarded, in a way she hadn't heard in years, made her chest ache with a grief that was entirely separate from the anger. She had loved this man, really loved him, not the idea of him, not the power of him, the specific person who had once sat beside her on a hospital floor at 2 a.m. after a miscarriage and said nothing useful and stayed anyway. That person existed. She knew he was still in there, somewhere underneath all the rest of it. It just wasn't enough. I'm going to find out who ordered it, she said. I'm going to give that information to the investigators. Whatever happens after that happens, and us? There is no us, Dante. A long quiet. Our daughter, he said. We'll have a father who visits under reasonable terms, when I've had time to establish what reasonable terms look like. She put the car in drive. But she's not a reason for me to protect people who tried to destroy me. She ended the call. She drove. The rain kept falling, the same light, relentless rain that asked nothing of anyone and simply continued regardless. Her phone buzzed. Not a call, a message. An unknown number, a different one than Leora's. She read it at a red light. Ms. Whitlock, my name is Martin Greaves. I've thought about what you said. I have a notarized statement. The name you're looking for is in it. Tell me how to get it to you safely. She stared at the message. The light turned green. She kept driving, one hand on the wheel, the other pressed flat against her belly where her daughter was moving with slow, steady purpose, as if she had somewhere to be and intended to get there. Seraphina typed back with her thumb, one-handed, at the next red light, tomorrow morning. Same coffee shop I used this morning, 8 o'clock. Bring the statement. She sent it. Then she kept driving. She was not afraid. Exactly. She was past the particular flavor of fear that had been with her since the night she found the heels at the bottom of the staircase. That fear had been personal, the fear of a woman whose marriage had collapsed, whose trust had been broken, whose future had suddenly become unrecognizable. That fear she understood and had made her peace with. This was something different. This was the specific alertness of a person who has looked at all the moving pieces and understood that the thing coming toward her is larger than she initially measured, and that she can't step out of its path, and that the only option remaining is to meet it head-on and make sure she is the one who chooses the terms of the collision. 43 days until Blackwater Harbor defaulted. A forged document with her name on it, already in the hands of federal investigators. A notarized statement from a man who had accessed her systems without authorization, waiting for her at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. And somewhere in the city, Victor Calloway making calls, tightening arrangements, deciding how to manage a situation he had created and now could not control. She pulled into the quiet street where Adrian's Cambridge property stood. She'd moved in 3 days after the gala, a decision she'd made practically rather than emotionally because she needed somewhere secure and somewhere not connected to the Calloways, and somewhere she could think. She parked. She sat for a moment. The light in the front window was on. Adrian had left it on for her. She got out of the car, walked up the front steps, and went inside. He was in the kitchen when she came through the door, a cup of coffee in his hand, looking at her with an expression that asked the question without asking it. I'm okay, she said. You look like you haven't slept in 3 days. 2.5. She set her bag on the table and sat down heavily in the nearest chair. The baby pressed against her ribs again, an insistent, rhythmic pressure. Greaves reached out. He's willing to give me a name. Adrian set the coffee down slowly. Whose name? She looked at him. Whoever ordered the forgery, she said. Tomorrow morning I find out who. He was quiet for a moment. And then, she said, I take it to the investigators and we find out how fast the whole thing falls. She put both hands on the table and looked at them. Her hands, bare of the ring she'd placed on a bedroom table 3 weeks ago, slightly swollen at the knuckles from the pregnancy, a small ink mark on her left index finger from the pen she'd been using all afternoon. Not the hands of someone who had destroyed anything. The hands of someone who was about to prove that. Outside, the rain continued. Somewhere across the city, in an office on Commonwealth Avenue, a man who had built an empire on the assumption that consequences could always be managed was making phone calls he believed would contain the damage. And in a kitchen in Cambridge, a woman who was 8 months pregnant, sleep-deprived, professionally threatened, and entirely out of patience was deciding that tomorrow she would find out the truth, and that whatever it cost her, she would pay it. She did not sleep well. That was not a surprise. She lay in the bed in the Cambridge house, a good bed, a quiet room, curtains that actually blocked the streetlight, and she stared at the ceiling and listened to the rain finish itself off somewhere around 2 in the morning. And then she listened to the silence that came after and tried to make her mind stop moving. It wouldn't stop. She kept turning the access logs over in her head. The 47 minutes, the 3 files accessed, 2 exported, the clean exit. Whoever had guided Greaves through that process, and she was increasingly certain someone had guided him, because Greaves was an administrator, not a technical person, not the kind of man who navigated proprietary financial software. By instinct, whoever that was had been very careful. Almost careful enough. Almost. She got up at 5:30 because lying down was no longer accomplishing anything. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table with the folder Leora had given her and went through it again, slowly, in the particular gray quiet of a morning that hadn't decided to be a morning yet. At 7 she heard Adrian's door. He came downstairs in the careful, slightly self-conscious way of a person who isn't sure how much noise they're allowed to make in a shared space that isn't quite their own yet, or rather, that belonged to him legally, but now contained someone else's morning. She found that consideration unexpectedly moving. She didn't say so. You've been up a while, he said, since 5:30. He looked at the folder on the table, the tea gone cold at her elbow, the specific stillness she had when she was working. He didn't ask if she was okay. He put the kettle on instead. I want to come with you this morning, he said. No. Seraphina, if you're there, it changes the dynamic. She looked up at him. Greaves is nervous. He reached out to me, not to you. If I walk in with someone, he reads it as escalation, and he might pull back. She paused. I need him to give me that statement. I can't give him any reason not to. Adrian stood at the counter with his back to her for a moment. She watched his shoulders. I'll be outside, he said. Not a question. That's fine, she said. The coffee shop was the same as the day before, same counter, same barista, same paper cups. Seraphina arrived at 7:50. She ordered tea again and took the same corner booth and sat with her back to the wall and watched the door. Greaves came in at 8:04. He was taller than she'd expected. She'd met him maybe twice in person over 7 years, always at large Calloway organizational functions, where he'd been background, administrative furniture, unremarkable. Up close, he looked like a man who had not slept at all. His face carried the particular gray quality of someone who had spent the night understanding the dimensions of the situation they were in and not finding anything reassuring in those dimensions. He sat down across from her and put his briefcase on the table and didn't open it immediately. She waited. I want you to know, he said, that I didn't understand what it was going to be used for. Tell me what you thought it was going to be used for, she said. He looked at his hands. He was 61 years old, and his hands were shaking slightly, a fine, barely visible tremor that he was clearly trying to control and not quite managing. I was told it was a routine financial modeling exercise. that the firm needed projections in a specific format for an internal review. He swallowed. I've done similar things before, accessing external models, formatting data for presentations. It's not unusual in my role. It's unusual to use someone else's credentials to access a private system, she said. Yes. He didn't argue it. Yes, it is. Who asked you to do it? He opened the briefcase. He took out a document several pages, bound with a binder clip, with a notary's seal visible on the last page. He set it on the table between them, but kept his hand on it for a moment. This covers everything, he said. What I was asked to do, when the exact instructions I was given, and the name of the person who gave them. He looked up at her. If I give you this, I need you to understand that I am putting myself in a significant amount of danger. I understand that, do you? His voice had something raw in it. I've worked for this organization for 23 years. I know what happens to people who... He stopped himself. Mr. Greaves, she held his gaze. I am 8 months pregnant, and I have been awake since 5 in the morning, and I have a forged document with my name on it sitting in a federal investigator's file. I am not in a position to minimize your situation because mine is not minimal either. She looked at the document under his hand. But if that statement says what I think it says, the person who gave you that order is going to have much larger problems than worrying about you. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he moved his hand. She picked up the document and read it. Her face did not change. She had trained herself, over years of reading financial documents that contained catastrophic information delivered in neutral language, to receive a bad news without broadcasting it. It was a professional discipline that served her now in a way she hadn't anticipated when she built it. She read the document twice, then she set it on the table. Victor Calloway, she said. Yes. She breathed. He contacted me directly, Greaves said. His voice had steadied slightly now that the document was on the table, as if releasing it had released something in him too. In February, he told me the project needed additional institutional support, and that a financial opinion from Whitlock Financial would carry the weight the lenders needed. He said you had verbally agreed to provide the opinion, but that due to your pregnancy, you hadn't been able to formalize it. She stared at him. He said you agreed. He told me you'd been consulted, that the opinion was consistent with your existing analysis. Greaves looked at the table. I didn't question it. I should have. I know I should have. But Victor Calloway does not get questioned. In 23 years, I have never... He stopped again. The files you exported from my system, she said. Who formatted the letter? Who produced the actual document? There's a man Victor uses for document work. I don't have his name. I transferred the files through an encrypted drive to an address Victor gave me. He paused. I never saw the finished letter. I didn't know it had been submitted as a formal opinion until I started hearing about the regulatory inquiry. She looked at the notarized statement. Victor Calloway's name, written into a sworn document by a man who had worked for him for 23 years. Why, she said, not performing the question, actually asking it. Why would he do this? Why not just find another way to prop up the financing? Why use my name? Greaves looked at her, and something in his expression shifted, something that looked almost like pity, which she found more disturbing than anything else he'd said. Because your name was worth more than anything the Calloway organization could produce on its own, he said. In the legitimate financial community, Whitlock Financial has a reputation that the Calloway name doesn't have. The institutional lenders, they weren't going to take Victor's word, or Dante's word, that the projections were sound. But yours? Your firm's formal opinion? He's exhaled. That was worth $40 million in additional financing. More, potentially. She sat with that. She had spent 7 years building a reputation that existed independently of the Calloway name. She had been careful about it, deliberate about it, had turned down work that would compromise it, and established boundaries that Dante and Victor had resented but tolerated because the results justified her terms. She had built something real and clean in a world that was neither, and Victor had used it like a tool he owned. I need you to provide this statement to the federal investigators directly, she said. Not through me, directly. He nodded. I've already contacted an attorney. Good. She stood up, carefully one hand on the edge of the table. Mr. Greaves, for what it's worth, what you did was wrong, and the consequences of it are going to be significant. But what you're doing now is the right thing. She picked up her bag. That doesn't cancel the first thing out, but it matters. He didn't say anything. She walked out. Adrian was parked across the street. She got in the passenger side and sat down and closed the door, and for a moment just breathed. Victor, she said. She felt Adrian go still beside her. Victor ordered it, she said, directly. Used Greaves to access my system. Used a document forger. Submitted a formal financial opinion in my name, without my knowledge or consent, to secure $40 million in additional financing for a project I had told them in writing was going to fail. Adrian was quiet for a moment. Are you okay? I keep getting asked that. I keep meaning it. She looked out the window. A woman was walking a dog on the sidewalk outside the coffee shop, moving fast because of the cold, the dog trotting in that purposeful, cheerful way dogs have of being completely present in whatever moment they're in. She watched them until they were out of sight. I'm angry, she said. Mostly I'm angry. That seems right. I spent 7 years. She stopped. Started again. I spent 7 years being very careful about what I would and wouldn't do, about keeping my firm's reputation separate from whatever the Calloway organization was doing at any given time. I drew lines. I held them. And Victor just... She pressed her fingers against her mouth for a moment. He just decided my reputation was a resource he could use. Like a piece of equipment, like something that belonged to him, because I was married to his son. Adrian didn't say anything, which was the correct thing to do. Take me to the federal building, she said. Now? Now. She had already spoken twice with the lead investigator on the case of a woman named Sandra Cho, compact and precise, with the quality of attention that made Seraphina feel simultaneously very seen and very exposed. Cho had the kind of face that didn't perform its reactions, which Seraphina respected because she tried to do the same thing and knew how much effort it required. The third meeting was different from the first two. The first two had been Seraphina providing information, establishing her position, documenting her complaint. This one, she walked in and set Greaves's notarized statement on the desk without preamble. Cho read it. Not quickly. She read it with the same slow, methodical attention she gave everything, and Seraphina sat across the desk and watched her read and tried to keep her breathing even. When Cho finished, she set the document down and looked at Seraphina. How did you get this? Cho asked. Martin Greaves contacted me last night. He asked to meet this morning. She paused. He's retained an attorney. He intends to cooperate fully with the investigation. You spoke with him directly. Yes. Cho looked at her for a moment, not accusatory, more evaluating. Ms. Whitlock, going forward, I'd like you to channel any contact from potential witnesses through this office. I understand. I also understand that if I had waited for formal investigative channels to develop, Victor Calloway would have had additional time to manage the situation. She held Cho's gaze. I filed my complaint before any of this became public. I provide documentation proactively. I am not protecting anyone in this situation. I know you're not. Cho tapped the corner of the statement with one finger. I need you to understand that what's in this document changes the scope of this investigation significantly. I know. It changes it in ways that are going to have consequences beyond Blackwater Harbor. I know that too. Cho looked at her. Are you prepared for that? Seraphina thought about it. Not performatively, she actually thought about it, turned it over, measured it against everything else she was carrying. The pregnancies, the firm, the legal exposure she'd been managing for weeks. The fact that she had not slept more than 4 consecutive hours since she found the heels at the bottom of the staircase. Yes, she said. She meant it. She was in the parking garage beneath the federal building when her phone rang. Not Dante. Not Adrian. A number she recognized after a moment as belonging to Vincent Marr, Victor Calloway's personal attorney, a man she had met precisely twice at large organizational functions, and who had given her the specific impression of someone who had made themselves very useful to very powerful people by being willing to do things that required a particular kind of moral flexibility. She answered, It's Whitlock. His voice was smooth and unhurried. I understand you've had a productive morning. She said nothing. Mr. Calloway would like to resolve this situation as expeditiously as possible, Mar said. He's prepared to make a substantial offer. I'm listening, she said, because she wanted to hear the shape of it. Full indemnification for Whitlock Financial against any liability arising from the Blackwater Harbor financing documents. A payment of $800,000 as compensation for professionals' disruption. And a formal public statement from the Calloway organization acknowledging that the financial appeal was produced without your knowledge or authorization. She stood in the parking garage and listened to him finish. In exchange, Mar continued, Mr. Calloway would require the withdrawal of your regulatory complaint, the return of any documentation currently in your possession related to the Blackwater financing, and your commitment not to cooperate with any federal investigation into the matter. She looked at a concrete pillar. There was a water stain on it, shaped vaguely like a map of somewhere she couldn't identify. You're asking me, she said slowly, to obstruct a federal investigation. I'm asking you to, that is what you're asking me to do. Withdraw cooperation from an active federal investigation in exchange for money. She paused. Mr. Mar, the statement that names your client as the person who ordered the forgery of my signature is already in the hands of federal investigators. It was there before you called. Silence. The offer, she said, is declined. She ended the call. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed that, distantly, she had expected them to shake, and they weren't. She called Adrian. I need you to come get me. Parking garage, federal building. 2 minutes, he said. She leaned against the concrete pillar with the water stain and breathed. The garage smelled like exhaust and cold concrete, the particular smell of underground places that never get sunlight. Her daughter shifted inside her, a long, slow movement that went from one side to the other, like she was turning over in her sleep. I know, Seraphina said quietly. Almost there. The call from Dante came 40 minutes later. She was in Adrian's car, heading back to Cambridge, when it came through, and she answered on the second ring, because she had learned, was still learning, to stop letting things go to voicemail, when the things that weren't in voicemail were worse. Mar called you, she said. I didn't know he was going to do that. Dante's voice was tight with something she recognized after a moment as genuine fury not at her, which was a change. I found out 20 minutes ago. I want you to know I didn't sanction that call. It doesn't matter whether you sanctioned it. It matters to me. Dante. She watched Cambridge go past the window. Your father's attorney called me in a federal building parking garage and asked me to obstruct a federal investigation for $800,000. Whatever you did or didn't sanction is a secondary issue. A pause. Are you okay? She almost laughed. She actually felt it rise in her throat before she caught it. Everyone keeps asking me that, because everyone is worried about you. Then everyone should have thought about that before they forged my name on a financial document. I know you didn't. I know. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a second. Dante, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Not like a Calloway, like the person you actually are. A silence. Okay, did you know, she said carefully, at any point before 3 weeks ago, any point at all, that Victor was planning to use my name in the Blackwater financing? The silence that followed was 3 seconds long. She counted. No, he said. She believed him. She wasn't sure whether to be relieved by that or not. In some ways, it would have been cleaner to have a single, unified betrayal to point at. What she had instead was a marriage that rotted in multiple directions simultaneously, which was somehow more disorienting than any one clean disaster would have been. What are you going to do? She asked. About Victor? Yes. Another silence. I've been asking myself that question since this morning. And he's my father, Dante said. I know he is. He built everything I have. I know that too. She paused. And he committed fraud using my name and then tried to bribe me to cover it up. Both things are true, I know. His voice had gone somewhere very quiet. I know both things are true. She watched the city moving outside the window. This was the part that nobody warned you about. She thought not the betrayal itself, but the way betrayal cracked open into other betrayals, like hitting a fault line and watching the fractures run further than you'd measured. She had thought the worst thing was Arabella in her bedroom. Then she had thought the worst thing was the forged letter. Then Victor's threat. Then Mar's call. She was beginning to suspect the worst things were not done arriving. "There's something I have to tell you," Dante said. Something in his voice, a specific quality of bracing, the tone of a person who has been carrying and has decided the moment to put it down is now made her go still. "Tell me," she said. "The Harrington Investor Group," he said. "The ones who put in $30 million on Blackwater. Their lead rep, a man named Forsyth, he's been talking to Victor's people." "Talking about what?" "About the investigations. About your complaint." A pause. "About the fact that before the forged letter, there was already documentation of your analysis of Blackwater Harbor. Your actual analysis. The one that said the project was unsound." She sat forward slightly. "What about it?" "Forsyth's position is that if a qualified financial analyst you had already determined the project was unsound, and the Calloway organization proceeded anyway, then the investors should have been informed." Another pause. "He's right. But the way Victor is framing it, the way Mar is framing it, is that your original analysis constitutes evidence that you knew the project was failing and chose to issue a positive opinion anyway." She absorbed this. "They're going to argue," he said slowly, "that the forged letter wasn't produced against my will. They're going to argue that I created it knowingly, because I had already assessed the project, and that by providing a positive opinion, I was attempting to conceal my own earlier negative findings." "Yes," Dante said. "They're going to use my own documentation against me." "Yes." She pressed her hand flat against the window. The glass was cold. Outside, a group of students crossed an intersection against the light, unhurried and unconcerned, with the particular invulnerability of the very young, who haven't yet learned that the vehicles will not always stop. "How solid is that argument?" she asked. "From a legal standpoint." Dante hesitated. "If they get the right presentation in front of the right people, before the investigation is framed the other way, before Greaves's statement sets the narrative, it could create enough ambiguity to make the investigators cautious about how hard they push Victor." She understood what he was telling her, the window she had, the narrow window between Greaves's statement arriving and Victor's legal team constructing an alternative narrative. If Victor moved fast enough, with enough resources, with enough connections in the right places, he could muddy the water before it had a chance to clear. "How much time do I have?" she asked. "I don't know." "Mar is good at what he does." "I know he is." She took her hand off the window. "Dante, does Victor know about Greaves's statement? Does he know it's already with the investigators?" A pause. "Probably within the hour, if he doesn't know already. And then he moves. And then he moves." She made a decision. "I need everything you have," she said. "Everything you've gathered in the last 3 weeks. Every document, every communication, every note you made while you were trying to figure out who forged the letter. I need it in my hands in the next 2 hours. Seraphina." "I know what I'm asking," she said. "I know what it means for you. I know what it means for your relationship with Victor." She kept her voice steady, and she meant every word of what came next. "And I'm not asking you to do it for me. I'm asking you to do it because it's the right thing, and because somewhere underneath everything else that's happened between us, you know that." The silence was long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Where do you want to meet?" They met in a parking lot outside a hotel in Brookline that had the anonymous quality of a place that wasn't paying attention to anything. Dante pulled up in a car she didn't recognize, not one of the Calloway vehicles, a plain dark sedan that smelled like a rental. He was alone. He handed her a flash drive through the window without getting out of the car. She looked at it. "Everything," he said. "Communications, timestamps, the financial trail I traced. The name of the document forger Victor uses a man named Riley, operates out of Providence." And he stopped. "What?" He looked at her through the open window. He looked exhausted in the way of a person who has been holding something up for a long time and has just decided to stop. "There's a second letter," he said. She went very still. "A second forged letter," he said. Victor had Riley produce 2. The one that went into the Blackwater financing package, and a second one, dated differently, addressed to the Harrington Investor Group specifically. The second one includes language that Forsyth's legal team could use to argue you had ongoing involvement in managing the project's public financial presentation. She stared at him. I found it 3 days ago, he said. I didn't tell you because I was still trying to verify it. I needed to be certain before. There is a second forged letter, she said, with my name on it. Yes. That your father commissioned. Yes. And that Forsyth's legal team either already has or is about to receive. Dante looked at the steering wheel. I believe so. Yes. She stood in that parking lot in Brookline in the particular cold of a November afternoon, and she held a flash drive in her hand, and she looked at her ex-husband through the window of a rental car, and she felt the ground shift. Not metaphorically. The actual physical sensation of something solid and trusted becoming uncertain beneath her. Her balance going slightly wrong, her body compensating without being asked to. She put one hand on the roof of the car to steady herself. Don't ask me if I'm okay, she said. He closed his mouth. She looked at the flash drive in her hand. She thought about Leora's folder, Greaves's statement, the access logs, the emergency complaint she'd filed 11 days ago, which now felt like it might not be enough, might not have been enough, might be exactly the thing Victor's legal team would try to use to create the impression of premeditation. She had one window, one narrow, rapidly closing window in which the evidence of what Victor had actually done could be placed in front of the investigators before Victor's resources and connections and legal team created a version of events in which Seraphina Whitlock was the architect of her own trap. I need to get to Cho's office, she said. Right now. Tonight. It's 7 o'clock. Then I'll call her. She was already dialing. Cho answered on the third ring. Seraphina didn't give her time to speak. I have additional evidence, she said, including a second forged document and communication records identifying the document forger by name and location. I need to get this to you tonight. A pause. How soon can you be here? 45 minutes, Seraphina said. I'll be here, Cho said. Seraphina ended the call and looked at Dante. Thank you, she said. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, Seraphina, whatever happens with Victor, I want you to know that what he did to you. He stopped. Started again. He used you. I let him. I let him have access to your work and your reputation for years because it was convenient for the organization, and I never thought about what it meant that he saw you as a resource. His voice had gone rough. That's on me. That's mine to own. She looked at him. The man she had married. The man who had failed her in multiple directions simultaneously. The man who had just handed her a flash drive that implicated his own father in a federal crime. I know, she said. She walked to Adrian's car. She got in. Drive, she said. He drove. She sat in the passenger seat with the flash drive in her hand and Dante's documents and the weight of all of it pressing down on her chest. And she thought about the second letter, the second forgery, the second use of her name, the second calculated decision by a man who had never once thought of her as a person who might push back. Victor had made one mistake, she thought. One fundamental, fatal mistake in his reading of her. He had looked at a woman who managed his son's legitimate business interests, who worked quietly and professionally within the boundaries she'd established, who had built her reputation through careful, methodical, unglamorous work, and he had decided that woman was manageable. He had decided she was the kind of person who, when threatened, would calculate the costs and choose safety. He was wrong. She had calculated the costs. She had looked at every angle, every risk, every possible consequence of what she was about to walk into that federal building and deliver. She had looked at it all with the same cold precision she brought to every financial analysis she had ever done. And she had decided that the cost of not doing it was higher. She pressed the flash drive between both palms like she was warming it, though it didn't need warming, and the gesture was entirely irrational. And she watched the city move past the window, and she breathed and she thought about her daughter, and she thought about the firm she had built from a second-hand desk, and 2 clients who were friends of friends, and she thought about the white lilies she always put in the front hall that someone had replaced with red peonies, and she thought about the person she had been when she believed that the worst thing that could happen to her already had. The federal building came into view. She opened the car door before Adrian had fully stopped. "I'm coming in with you," he said. This time, she didn't argue. They walked in together through the glass doors, into the fluorescent light, into the particular bureaucratic stillness of a government building at 7:40 in the evening. And Seraphina Whitlock's, 8 months pregnant, carrying a flash drive and a folder, and 3 weeks of accumulated fury, and not a single remaining illusion about the world she had been living in, walked toward the elevator and pressed the button for Sandra Cho's floor. The doors closed behind her, and on the other side of the city, in an office on Commonwealth Avenue, Victor Calloway's phone was ringing his attorney, his contacts, his people, the architecture of influence he had spent 4 decades building, all of it beginning to move in response to the news that the woman he had underestimated was not, in fact, going to stop. Sandra Cho worked late on Tuesdays. Seraphina didn't know that before tonight, but she filed it away as information about the kind of person. Cho was not someone who stayed late to be seen staying late, but someone who stayed because the work was there, and walking away from incomplete work was something she apparently didn't know how to do. The office at 7:50 in the evening had the specific energy of a place that hadn't stopped moving, even though the building around it had gone quiet. And when Cho opened the conference room door and saw Seraphina and Adrian, she looked at the flash drive in Seraphina's hand and said simply, "Sit down." Seraphina sat. She set the flash drive on the table. Then she set Leora's folder. Then she set the printed copy of Greaves's statement, which Cho already had, but which Seraphina had kept her own copy of because she was not operating on trust anymore. Cho looked at the materials. Then she looked at Seraphina's face with the attention of someone reading a document. "You're in pain," she said. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're 8 months pregnant, and you look like you've been awake for 2 days. "I've been awake for most of them, yes. I'd like to finish this conversation before I think about that." Seraphina pressed her hands flat on the table. "There is a second forged document. The flash drive has the communication chain that led to it. The identity of the man Victor Calloway uses for document work, first name Riley, operates out of Providence. My ex-husband can provide additional details and the financial trail connecting the forgeries to Victor's direct authorization." Cho pulled the flash drive toward her without picking it up yet. "Where did you get this?" "Dante Calloway." A pause. "He gave this to you voluntarily?" "Yes. Tonight." "Approximately 40 minutes ago, in a parking lot in Brookline." She held Cho's gaze. "He has been conducting his own investigation for 3 weeks. He found the second document 3 days ago. He gave me everything he had." Cho looked at her steadily. "Ms. Whitlock, I need to ask you something directly." "Ask it. Is there anything in your relationship with Dante Calloway, any financial arrangement, any ongoing connection, any end agreement of any kind that would complicate your position as a witness in this investigation?" The question landed cleanly, and Seraphina received it cleanly. "No," she said, "we are separated. He is the father of my unborn child. We have no financial arrangements. I have not accepted any payment or consideration from the Calloway organization. I have not agreed to protect anyone." She paused. "I am providing this evidence because a crime was committed using my name, and I intend to be very clear about that in every forum available to me." Cho nodded once. She picked up the flash drive. "I'm going to need you here tomorrow morning. 8 o'clock. We're going to go through all of this, and I'm going to need a recorded statement." "I'll be here, and I need you to stop meeting with witnesses," Cho said. "Greaves, Dante Calloway, I understand why you did it. I understand the time pressure. But going forward, this has to go through us." "Understood." Cho stood. Seraphina stood. The motion of standing, the sheer physical effort of getting her body upright after 2 hours in a hard conference room chair sent a bolt of pain across her lower back that she felt all the way up to her shoulder. Blades, and she made a sound before she could stop it. Not loud, just a short caught breath. Cho looked at her. "I'm fine," Seraphina said. "You said that already." "It's still true." Adrian took her arm at the elbow, not dramatically, just steadying, and she let him, because the alternative was doing something undignified with a chair. They went home. She slept for 5 hours. Actual sleep, not the shallow circling she'd been doing for weeks, real unconsciousness, the kind that arrived because her body had decided it was owed something and was collecting. She woke at 5:45 to her phone buzzing on the nightstand, and she lay there for 30 seconds, perfectly still, feeling the weight of everything that was waiting for her on the other side of that buzz. Then she picked it up. The message was from a number she didn't recognize. 6 words: Greaves is in the hospital. Car accident. She sat up. Her whole body came awake at once, the way it does when the information arriving is bad enough to override the body's preference for gradual consciousness. She sat on the edge of the bed and read the message 3 times. She called Cho at 6:02. Cho answered on the first ring, which meant Cho already knew. "I saw the message," Seraphina said. "Is he alive?" "He's alive." Cho's voice was flat and careful. "He's in surgery. Hit by a car on Mass Ave around midnight. Driver didn't stop." The statement. We have the statement. He submitted it through his attorney yesterday afternoon before the accident. A pause that had weight in it. "Ms. Whitlock, I want you to be aware that we are taking additional precautions." "What kind of precautions?" "The kind that mean I'd like you to remain at your current address and inform me before you go anywhere today." Another pause. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" She understood. "Yes," she said. She hung up. She sat on the edge of the bed and breathed. In the next room, she could hear nothing. Adrian slept quietly. Another piece of information she was filing away, without intending to. Her daughter was awake, moving with the particular morning restlessness she'd been developing over the past 2 weeks, a kind of insistent wriggling that pressed against Seraphina's lower ribs and refused to be ignored. "I hear you," she said softly. She got up. She went to the kitchen. She put the kettle on and stood at the counter and tried to think clearly about what had just changed. Greaves's statement was secure, already submitted, already in Cho's possession, already on the record. That was the most important thing. Whatever had happened to Greaves on Mass Ave at midnight, it had happened after the statement was delivered, which meant Victor had either not known the statement existed, or had not acted quickly enough, or had decided it didn't matter, because the statement wasn't enough on its own, or had decided to send a message anyway. The kettle was loud in the morning quiet, and she turned it off before it fully boiled, and poured the water over the tea bag and stood there, holding the mug with both hands, feeling the warmth move into her palms. Her phone rang. "Dante, I heard about Greaves," he said before she could speak. "Are you somewhere safe?" she asked. A pause. The pause told her something. "I'm not the one you need to worry about." That's not an answer. "I'm at the mansion. I have people." A pause. "Seraphina. Victor knows about the flash drive. I don't know how, but he knows." She set the mug down. "When did he find out?" "Within the last 2 hours. Mar called me at 4 in the morning. His voice had a tight, controlled quality she recognized from years of watching him manage situations he hadn't anticipated. He stopped. "He's moving fast. He's calling in things I didn't know he could call. People I didn't know he still had access to." "What people?" "People in positions to make certain investigations more complicated than they need to be." He paused. "He has a contact at the state attorney's office. Someone who owes him." She thought about Cho's call. The additional precautions. "Cho's office is federal," she said. "State contact doesn't affect a federal investigation." "Not directly." Another pause. "But if the state attorney's office files a competing claim on the Blackwater evidence, if they argue jurisdictional overlap and request the materials be held pending review, it stalls everything," she said. "Long enough for Victor's legal team to build the alternative narrative. The one where you knew about the fraud." His voice dropped. "He has 3 days, Seraphina. If he can create enough procedural obstruction in the next 3 days, the window closes." She looked at the kitchen window. The morning was gray and flat, the sun not visible yet behind a solid cover of cloud. "He's not going to stop," Dante said. "I need you to understand that. I know him. I have watched him manage situations for 40 years, and I have never seen him decide that a problem was too big to manage. He will keep moving until someone physically stops him, or he cut himself off. Or," she said, "or until there's nothing left to protect." She understood what he was saying. Victor Calloway was not going to accept exposure. He was going to fight the investigation with every tool available to him and he had tools she couldn't fully see, contacts she didn't know about, and 40 years of practice at making problems disappear. And she had 3 days. "I have to go," she said. "Seraphina." His voice caught on something. "Be careful." She ended the call. She was at Cho's office by 7:15, 45 minutes ahead of the scheduled meeting. She told Adrian to wait in the lobby, which he accepted without argument, and she went up alone and found Cho already at her desk, looking like she'd been there since 5. "Victor Calloway has a contact in the state attorney's office," Seraphina said before she sat down. "He's going to try to create jurisdictional obstruction. Stall the investigation. 3 days." Cho looked up from her computer. "How do you know this?" "Dante Calloway. This morning." Cho was quiet for a moment. Then she stood up and walked to her office door and called down the hallway. "Chen." "My office." She came back and looked at Seraphina. "Sit down." Seraphina sat. Chen was a younger man with the appearance of someone who had learned to be relentlessly organized. Because the alternative was catastrophic tight posture, sharp eyes, the kind of person who had multiple copies of everything. He appeared in the doorway in under a minute. "Get me everything we have on jurisdictional status," Cho said. "And get Fletcher on the phone now." Chen left. Cho sat down and looked at Seraphina. "The flash drive your ex-husband provided. I had my team on it from midnight. There are 17 distinct pieces of evidence on it, including 3 audio recordings." Seraphina went still. "Audio recordings. Your ex-husband was more thorough than I expected." Something that wasn't quite a smile moved across Cho's face. "One of the recordings is a phone conversation between Victor Calloway and Martin Greaves from February of this year, in which Victor explicitly instructs Greaves to access your system and export the models." Cho paused. "In that conversation, Victor uses your name. He refers to the financial opinion letters as something that needs to exist. He tells Greaves to make it look like her." Seraphina heard a sound in her own ears, a brief, rushing sound, like water moving. She pressed both feet flat on the floor. Dante recorded his father. Apparently, over several months. The recordings begin approximately 4 months before the forged letter appeared in the financing package. Cho looked at her steadily. "Ms. Whitlock, I want to be transparent with you, because you have been transparent with me. What we have on this flash drive is sufficient to proceed without the possibility of the alternative narrative Victor Calloway's legal team is attempting to construct. Your prior documented analysis of Blackwater Harbor, the warnings you put in writing, corroborates your position. The audio corroborates everything else." Seraphina sat with that. "Then why the 3 days?" she asked. "If the evidence is sufficient." "Because sufficient and decisive are different things. Victor's legal team will file every motion available to them. They will challenge the provenance of the recordings. They will challenge the chain of custody. They will file for delays, for reviews, for recusals." Cho's voice was level and precise. "They will not win those challenges, but each one takes time, and in that time, pressure will be applied in various directions." She paused. "Including to you." Seraphina understood. He's going to come after the firm. His attorney filed a civil complaint against Whitlock Financial at 9 o'clock last night, alleging professional misconduct in connection with the Blackwater Harbor analysis. Cho said it without preamble. "The complaint is without merit, and we can demonstrate that. But it will require your firm's attorney to respond, which will consume time and resources, which is the point." She thought about Marcus, about her 12 employees, about the clients who had trusted her with their institutional money and whose first reaction to a civil complaint in the news would be to call her and ask what was happening. She thought about the work she had done for 20 years, built piece by piece on the simple principle of doing it right and being honest about what she found. She thought about the red peonies. "What do I do right now?" she said. "You give me a recorded statement covering everything from the beginning. Every document, every conversation, every decision you made and when you made it." Cho leaned forward slightly. "And then you go home and you rest, because you are 8 months pregnant, and I need you functional for what comes next." "What comes next?" "The public phase," Cho said. "Victor's legal team will attempt to control the narrative in the press as well. When this breaks publicly, and it will break, in the next 24 to 48 hours, Your version of events needs to already be documented, detailed, and corroborated. She paused. Which it is. But I want your statement on record before the noise starts. The recorded statement took 4 hours. Seraphina talked until her throat was dry, and Cho asked questions in her careful, unhurried way, and the words came out in the right order, because she had been through it enough times in her own head. The sequence was clear. She talked about Blackwater Harbor, and the analysis she'd done, and the warnings she'd written, and the meetings where those warnings were dismissed. She talked about the night she found the access logs, about Leora Strand, about Greaves, about Victor's office, the threat, the offer, the refusal, about the parking lot in Brookline and the flash drive. She talked about all of it. When they finished, she sat for a moment in the silence of the conference room, which smelled like coffee and recycled air, and the particular fatigue of 4 hours of precise recollection. Then her phone rang. She looked at the screen. An unknown number. She answered because she had been answering unknown numbers all week, and the pattern of what they contained was relevant information. Ms. Whitlock, a voice she didn't recognize. Male, older, carefully neutral. My name is not important. What I need to tell you is... Cho was watching her. Seraphina held up one finger and turned on the speaker. Victor Calloway has been in contact with a federal prosecutor in the Boston District Office, the voice said. A man named Hargrove. They have a history that predates the current investigation. Hargrove is being asked to request a transfer of case management that would move the investigation to a less senior investigative team. Cho's expression didn't change. She reached for her phone. Who are you? Seraphina asked. Someone who was asked to facilitate communication between Hargrove and Calloway, and declined. A pause. I'm giving you this because what's being done to you is wrong, and because Hargrove has done this before. Another pause. That's all I can give you. The call ended. The conference room was very quiet. Cho was already typing on her phone with the fastest speed of someone's making an urgent communication. I know Hargrove, she said without looking up, and I know his history with the Calloway organization. She pressed send on whatever she'd written. This is not going to work the way Victor thinks it is. Are you sure? Seraphina asked. Cho looked up. No, she said. But I'm about to make some phone calls that will make it significantly less likely to work. The call from Marcus came at 2:15 in the afternoon. She was in a car with Adrian, heading back to Cambridge, eating a sandwich that Adrian had produced from somewhere practical bread, turkey, the kind of food that was entirely about function and not at all about anything else when Marcus called. And she answered and heard, in the first half second of his breathing, that something had gone wrong. The offices, he said. What about the offices? Someone's been here. He stopped. They went through the physical files. The server room, the door was forced. I don't know what they took. She stopped eating. Did you call the police? I called you first. Call the police. Right now. Don't touch anything. She was already reaching for Cho's number with her other hand. I'm on my way. Marcus's voice had something in it she'd never heard before from him. Marcus was 34 and had worked for her for 6 years and was one of the most practically unflappable people she'd ever met. What was in his voice now was genuine fear. There's a message. Written on the whiteboard in the main conference room. What does it say? A pause. It says stop now. She sat in the moving car and held both phones, one to each ear, and looked at the gray Cambridge street going past the window. And something moved through her that was not quite fear and not quite fury, something older and more fundamental than either. The specific physical response of a person who has been cornered and knows it and is making a decision about what to do in a corner. Okay, she said to Marcus. Call the police. I'm coming. She ended the call. Adrian was already turning the car around. He hadn't heard Marcus's side of the conversation, but he'd heard hers, and he had the specific quality in that moment of a person who doesn't need the full information before they respond to the important part. My office, she said. He drove. The Whitlock Financial Office had the particular wrong quality of a place that has been violated, the kind of wrongness that isn't dramatic or visible from a distance, but becomes immediately apparent when you walk through the door and feel that the air inside is not the air of a place that belongs only to the people who work there. It had been entered by someone who had no right to enter it, and that fact sat in the space like a smell. 3 police officers were already there. Marcus met her at the elevator, his face tight, his normally precise appearance slightly disordered, his collar open at the button in a way she'd never seen. He walked her through it quickly. The physical filing cabinets in the records room had been forced. Not all of them specific drawers, targeted. The server room door had been bypassed with what the police were describing as a professional-grade bypass tool, and one of the backup drives was gone. The main server itself appeared undisturbed, which meant whoever did this either wasn't after the main data, or knew that the main data was encrypted and backed up remotely, and the backup drives were easier. Or they wanted her to know they could get in. The whiteboard message was still there when she walked into the conference room. Plain block letters in black marker. Stop now. She looked at it for a long time. Then she walked to the whiteboard, picked up an eraser, and wiped it off. One of the police officers was watching her. She didn't explain this gesture. She didn't need to. She called Cho from the conference room. My office was broken into, she said. A backup drive was taken. There's a message on the whiteboard. She paused. Cho, this is not going to stop me. A brief silence. I know, Cho said. What's the status on Hargrove? Being managed. Cho's voice was very controlled. I made the calls. The case is not moving. And Victor? His legal team filed 3 motions in the last 2 hours. All of them are being opposed. Another pause. Whitlock, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it clearly. Tell me. The next 36 hours are going to be the hardest part. Victor has more resources than most people we go after, and he's using all of them simultaneously. He's trying to overwhelm the system, flood it, with motions and complaints, and procedural challenges and civil actions, all at once, so that no single piece can be addressed before the next one arrives. A pause. That's a strategy that works against ordinary pressure. It doesn't work against evidence this solid, but it creates a period of maximum noise and maximum risk for you personally. What does that mean for me? It means, Cho said carefully, that I want you to be somewhere secure tonight. Not here, not at your firm. Somewhere Victor's people don't know about. She thought about the Cambridge house. She thought about the fact that she had been staying there for 2 weeks, and that Dante knew where it was, and that Dante had given her the flash drive, and that she believed he hadn't told Victor, but that she had also believed a number of things recently that had turned out to be inadequately verified. I have somewhere, she said. Adrian's sister lived in Lexington, in a house that had no connection to anything, not to him, not to Seraphina, not to the Calloway organization, not to Blackwater Harbor, not to any of the names and addresses and known locations that Victor's people might be working from. She was 42 and a pediatrician, and she had a spare room and, apparently, a very high tolerance for unusual situations, because when Adrian called her, she said yes, without asking more than 2 questions. They drove to Lexington at 4 in the afternoon. Seraphina sat in the passenger seat and felt the pain that had been building across her lower back for the past 3 hours, with a frankness she hadn't been allowing herself earlier. It had moved from a dull pressure to something more specific and insistent, the kind of pain that asked to be paid attention to rather than catalogued and set aside. She said nothing about it. Adrian's sister, her name was Claire, and she was shorter than Adrian, with the same precise way of moving, the same economy of gesture, opened the door and looked at Seraphina once and said, "You need to sit down and eat something real." I had a sandwich. That wasn't real. Come in. She sat at Claire's kitchen table and ate soup that Claire produced efficiently and without fanfare. And for 20 minutes, she did not think about Victor Calloway or forged documents or federal investigators or any of it. She just ate. The pain across her back continued. At 6 o'clock, Cho called. She answered immediately. The state attorney's jurisdictional filing was rejected, Cho said. The federal case is proceeding without interference. A pause. Victor's legal team has filed an emergency injunction attempting to suppress the audio recordings on the basis of illegally obtained evidence. Can they do that? They can file it. A judge will hear it tomorrow morning. Another pause. The recordings were made by Dante Calloway in his own home, of conversations he was party to. The legal threshold for suppression is very high. We're not anticipating success on their part. Cho's voice had the quality of someone choosing their words with exact care. I want to be honest with you. There is a 10 to 15% chance the judge rules against us on the recordings. If that happens, we proceed with everything else. The case is solid without them. But the recordings make it decisive. What time tomorrow? Seraphina asked. 9 in the morning. She looked at the kitchen wall. Claire's kitchen had the comfortable, slightly accumulated quality of a space that had been lived in by someone who was too busy to redecorate and too satisfied to feel like they needed to. There were children's drawings held to the refrigerator with magnets, a crack in the plaster by the window that had been painted over without being fully repaired, a wooden spoon standing in a jar on the counter that had clearly been there for years. Normal, lived in, real. Okay, she said. 9 o'clock. She ended the call. The pain moved. It moved in a way that was different from how it had been moving from the distributed background ache of a heavily pregnant woman who had been sitting in hard chairs and moving too much and sleeping too little into something more directional and more specific and considerably more urgent. She sat very still. Adrian, she said. He was in the doorway. He looked at her face, and she watched his expression change, not dramatically. Just a shift, a settling into a different kind of attention. Yeah, he said. I think we need to go to the hospital. He had the car keys in his hand before she finished the sentence. Claire was at the table in 3 steps. How far apart? It's Seraphina breathed. It's not contractions yet. It's pressure. It's different from what it's been. She looked at Claire. I'm a week early. That's fine, Claire said, with the particular calm authority of a pediatrician who had been managing medical anxiety in non-emergency situations for 20 years. 1 week is fine, Adrian. Take her. I'll call ahead. Adrian took her arm. She stood the motion, sent another wave of that directional pain through her lower back. And she stopped for a second, just stopped, and breathed through it. Her phone buzzed in her hand. She looked at it. A news alert. The Boston Globe, breaking news notification. Federal investigation. Victor Calloway, patriarch of prominent Boston family, named in major financial fraud inquiry. Investigation centers on Blackwater Harbor development. She stared at it. It was out. Whatever Victor's legal team was doing, however many motions they'd filed, the story was out. Which meant Cho had made a decision about timing, or a decision had been made for her, or the pressure had been released in the only direction pressure can ultimately go when you apply enough of it. She was standing in Claire Blackridge's kitchen in Lexington at 6:20 in the evening, 8 months and 3 weeks pregnant, in the early stages of labor, holding her phone with a breaking news alert on the screen. She put the phone in her bag. Okay, she said. Let's go. They went out to the car. Adrian's hand was at her back, steady and present. Not performatively protective, but practically useful in the way of a person who was paying attention to what she actually needed, rather than to the version of the situation that would make him feel useful. She got in the car. She thought about the 9 o'clock hearing tomorrow morning, which she would not be at. She thought about Cho, who would be there with or without her. She thought about Dante, who was somewhere on the other side of the city, with his people and his father's burning empire, and the particular weight of having turned the match over himself. She thought about the flash drive in Cho's evidence room. She thought about Greaves in surgery. She thought about 17 pieces of evidence, 3 audio recordings, a notarized confession, an emergency complaint filed 11 days ago, before any of it became public, establishing her position in writing before the noise started. She thought about the forged letter and the second forged letter, and the red peonies, and the shoes at the bottom of the staircase, and the 47 minutes in her system and Victor's hands folded on his desk, completely still, working very hard at something. The car moved through the Lexington night toward the hospital, and another wave of pain moved through her, and she breathed through it, the way she had been breathing through hard things all her life, steadily, without performance. Not pretending it wasn't happening, and not being destroyed by the fact that it was. Her daughter was coming. Victor's empire was beginning to fall. And in the federal building on the other side of the city, in a conference room where the lights were still on at 6:47, In the evening, Sandra Cho was sitting across a desk from a federal judge's clerk, explaining exactly why the motion to suppress the audio recordings was going to fail, and why it was going to fail tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, and why nothing, not a jurisdictional filing, not a civil complaint, not a broken into office, not 40 years of carefully maintained influence was going to change the fundamental fact of what was. On the record, documented, and already beyond the reach of anything Victor Calloway could do to stop it. Her daughter was born at 2:17 in the morning. Not dramatically, not with the cinematic urgency of a crisis, arriving at the worst possible moment. It was simply long and hard and exhausting, the way labor is, without apology or narrative consideration, for the fact that the woman going through it had also spent the previous 16 hours in federal offices and broken into conference rooms and the back seats of cars moving through the dark. The body does not wait for convenient timing, it simply proceeds. Adrian stayed in the waiting room. He had offered quietly and without pressure to be elsewhere if she preferred, and she had said the waiting room was fine, which was the closest she could come to saying that she wanted him nearby without knowing yet exactly what that meant or what shape it would take going forward. Dante arrived at 11:50. She knew because a nurse told her carefully that there was a man in the lobby who had given his name and asked whether he was permitted to wait. The nurse had the particular diplomatic neutrality of someone who had navigated this specific variety of complicated situation before and had learned that the correct posture was to relay information without editorializing. "Tell him he can wait," Seraphina said. He waited. She did not think about him during the hours that followed, which was not deliberate. She simply had nothing left over. The work of bringing a child into the world consumes everything available and then reaches for more. And by the time it was finished, she was somewhere beyond tired, in the specific hollowed-out territory that exists past exhaustion, where the body has spent everything it had and is running on something older and more basic than energy. The baby was placed on her chest, 7 pounds 2 ounces. A full head of dark hair, which surprised her. She'd imagined something more ambiguous, more newborn generic, but this child arrived with opinions about her appearance already apparently formed. Dark eyes that couldn't yet focus, but moved with an alert, searching quality, like someone arriving in a new place and immediately beginning to assess it. Seraphina looked at her daughter for a long time, without speaking. She had a name ready. She had decided on it 6 weeks ago, in the quiet of an evening when she'd been sitting alone in the Cambridge house and had opened a notebook to make a list of things she needed to do, and instead had written a name at the top of the page. Without planning to, and had looked at it, and had known. "Nora," she said softly. "Hi." The baby made a sound that was not yet language and not yet anything recognizable, just the raw, unprocessed noise of a new person discovering that they have a voice. Seraphina felt something happen in her chest, that she didn't have a word for, not happiness exactly, though happiness was part of it. Something more structural than happiness. Something that felt like the ground becoming solid again after a very long time of it being uncertain. At 4 in the morning, a nurse came to tell her that the man in the lobby was still there. "Which one?" she asked, because she had momentarily forgotten there were 2. "Both," the nurse said. She thought about that. "Tell them both they can go home," she said. "Tell them I'll call in the morning." The nurse left. Whether both men actually went home, she didn't know. She was asleep before she could wonder about it for long, her daughter in the bassinet beside the bed, the hospital quiet around them in the specific way of a place that never fully sleeps but has learned to modulate itself for the hours when most of its occupants need it to be still. Cho called at 8:15. Seraphina was awake, had been awake since 6, feeding Nora with the effortful concentration of someone learning a new skill under conditions that did not allow for a learning curve, and she answered with the phone propped against her shoulder, her hands occupied. The motion to suppress was denied, Cho said. 7 minutes into the hearing. The judge didn't need the full argument. Seraphina exhaled slowly. "The recordings are admissible," Cho continued. "All 3 of them. Victor's legal team has filed a notice of appeal, which is their right, but the standard for appellate intervention at this stage is very high, and we're not anticipating a successful challenge." A pause. "Ms. Whitlock, I also want to tell you that the civil complaint against Whitlock Financial was withdrawn this morning. Victor's attorneys filed the withdrawal at 7:45. She looked at Nora, who was doing a focused, serious work of existing in the world. Why withdraw it? She asked. Because maintaining it while facing federal fraud charges becomes a liability rather than a tool. It draws attention to the pattern of harassment. Victor's team is smart enough to cut what isn't serving them anymore. Another pause. How are you? I had a baby 4 hours ago. A brief silence. Congratulations, Cho said, and meant it Seraphina could tell, the same way you can always tell when someone means something versus when they're performing the meaning. Thank you. She looked at the window. Morning light, flat and gray, the particular light of a November morning that had decided to be overcast about it. What happens now with Victor? The jury convenes in 3 weeks. Between now and then, we're building the presentation. Greaves is out of surgery, and his attorney has confirmed he'll cooperate fully. The document forger Riley was taken into custody in Providence last night. He's already talking. Cho's voice was level and precise. Victor Calloway is going to be indicted, Ms. Whitlock. That is not a prediction. That is where the evidence leads, and there is no procedural mechanism available to him that changes it. She sat with that. Victor Calloway, 71 years old, silver-haired, hands folded completely still on his desk. The most powerful man in whatever room he entered. 40 years of building something that he had believed was impervious to consequence, because consequence was something that happened to people who didn't have enough resources to prevent it. What about Dante? She asked. Dante Calloway cooperated fully with the investigation. He provided evidence that materially advanced the case. His own exposure relates primarily to the legitimate business operations, which are subject to separate civil proceedings. A pause. He's not going to be criminally charged, Ms. Whitlock. Not on the basis of what we have. She had not realized she'd been holding tension around that question until it released. Not because she wanted to protect Dante, or not only because of that. Because Nora was 4 hours old, and her father being criminally charged in the first days of her life was a weight that Seraphina did not want her daughter to carry from the beginning. Thank you, she said, for telling me. You deserve to know. A brief pause. Rest. We'll need you available for the grand jury process, but not for several weeks. Take care of yourself and your daughter. Cho ended the call. Seraphina set the phone on the bed beside her and looked at Nora and breathed. Dante came at 10 o'clock. He'd called first, which she noted. Not arrived and announced himself through a nurse called and asked and waited for her to say yes before he came. She told the nurse to bring him up. He looked like he hadn't slept. He was in clothes she didn't recognize, not his usual suits, just dark trousers and a plain gray shirt, which was so unlike his ordinary appearance that it registered as its own kind of information. He looked, she thought, like a man who had put down something very heavy and was not entirely sure yet what his body felt like without it. He stopped just inside the doorway and looked at Nora in the bassinet. He stood there for a long moment without speaking. Seraphina watched him. She watched his face do something she had not seen it do in years, not the controlled strategic expressions she'd been cataloging for months, not the performed versions of emotion that powerful men learn to deploy. Something unguarded, something that arrived without being managed. He started. Yes, she said. He crossed to the bassinet and looked down at his daughter. He was a large man, and the bassinet was small, and the visual proportion of it was almost absurd. This person who had spent decades making rooms arrange themselves around him, standing over 7 pounds of new human being, with an expression that had nowhere to hide. Nora, Seraphina said. Her name is Nora. He said nothing for a moment. Then, very quietly, that's good. He didn't reach in. He didn't ask to hold her. He just looked, with the specific restraint of someone who understands that they are in a space where they have no automatic rights, where every access is permitted rather than assumed, and who has accepted that as the correct and appropriate state of things. After a while, he straightened and looked at Seraphina. The motion was denied, he said. I know, Cho called. He nodded. He looked at the window. My father is going to be indicted. Yes. He looked back at her. I want you to know that I don't regret giving you the flash drive. I know you don't. I want you to know it wasn't. He stopped. Started again, more carefully. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't about managing the outcome for myself. I gave it to you because what he did to you was wrong, and because I spent 3 weeks trying to find another way to handle it, and there wasn't one. He paused. And because you deserved to have it. She looked at him. The man she had married. The man who had failed her in ways that were specific and documented and not abstract. The man who had also, in the end, walked into a parking lot in Brookline and handed her a flash drive containing evidence against his own father, because she was right and he knew it, and he had finally decided that knowing something was right and not doing it was a line he wasn't willing to cross. People were not singular, she had learned. That was the thing that made them hardest to understand and hardest to leave and hardest to stop loving, even after the loving had been made impossible. They contained the thing that hurt you and the thing that saved you at the same time, and the work of sorting out what you did with both of those things was yours alone to do. You should go, she said, not unkindly. He looked at Nora once more. Can I come back to see her? Yes. Call first. She paused. And Dante, when you come, it's to see Nora. It's not to see me. He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved across his face that she didn't try to name. Understood, he said. He left. She listened to his footsteps in the hallway, that walk on she knew better than she knew most things, that specific pace and weight until they were gone. Then she looked at her daughter. Your father, she said softly, is a complicated man. But he loves you. I can already tell. She touched Nora's hand, which was curled loosely at the side of her face, the fingers not quite fully open, in the particular way of new hands that haven't yet decided what they want to reach for. I'll let you make up your own mind about the rest. Martin Greaves was released from the hospital 11 days after the accident. He had a broken collarbone, 3 fractured ribs, and a concussion that had resolved without lasting damage. He cooperated fully with the federal investigation as he had promised, and his attorney negotiated an agreement that reflected the degree of his cooperation and the degree of his culpability, which were both substantial in different directions. He testified before the grand jury. He told the truth. It cost him the life he had built over 23 years, and he paid that cost without asking anyone else to absorb part of it, which Seraphina found she respected more than she had expected to. She never spoke to him again after the coffee shop in Somerville, but she heard from Cho that he had relocated to another state and was doing work that had nothing to do with organized money or organized anything. She hoped it was true. She had no particular warmth toward him, but she also had no desire for his destruction, beyond the destruction that was a direct consequence of what he had done. That felt like enough. Riley, the document forger, pled guilty. He had a long history that predated his work for Victor Calloway, and his cooperation produced information that extended beyond the Blackwater case into several other investigations that Seraphina had no visibility into and did not seek visibility into. That part of the world was not her world. The civil suit's Whitlock Financial was withdrawn, as Cho had told her it would be. Her firm's attorney sent her a letter confirming the withdrawal with a level of legal formality that made the 3-line document feel like a small ceremony, which she supposed it was. She read it at the kitchen table in the Cambridge house, while Nora slept in the carrier strapped to her chest, the baby's weight warm and solid against her sternum. She kept the letter, filed it, not as a trophy as documentation. The habit of a woman who had learned that the paper trail was the thing that survived when everything else was contested. The grand jury indicted Victor Calloway on 11 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The indictment was unsealed on a Thursday morning in January, 4 weeks after Nora was born, and within an hour the press had it. Seraphina learned about it from a news alert on her phone, sitting in a coffee shop in Cambridge, the Somerville one. Not the Somerville one. A different one, closer to the house, with better chairs and a barista who had started recognizing her order. She read the alert and then set her phone face down on the table and looked at her coffee. She felt nothing cinematic, no surge of vindication, no particular satisfaction. What she felt was something quieter and more durable, the specific sensation of a long and difficult piece of work being completed. The kind of feeling you get when you've been carrying something heavy across a long distance and you finally set down. And what you feel is not triumph, but the simple, functional relief of your arms being empty. She picked up her phone and called Cho. "I saw," she said. "I thought you might." Cho paused. "Your documentation was central to the case. The emergency complaint you filed before any of this became public that established the timeline in a way that made the alternative narrative impossible to build. Victor's legal team tried 6 different approaches to constructing a version of events where you were implicated. Every one of them broke against the timeline. I filed it because it was true," Seraphina said. "I know. That's why it worked." She ended the call. She sat with her coffee for a while. Outside the window, Cambridge was doing its ordinary January things, people moving fast because of the cold, a dog pulling its owner toward something interesting. A delivery truck double-parked with the universal optimism of delivery trucks everywhere. She watched all of it without thinking about it very much. Then she went home. She had dinner that night with Adrian and Claire and 2 of her employees from the firm who had become, the past several months, something more like friends than employees transition she'd resisted for years. Thinking professional distance was protective, discovering that what it was actually was lonely. The dinner was at the Cambridge house, which she had extended the rental on because she liked it and because Nora seemed to like it, insofar as a 2-month-old could be said to have opinions about architecture. The table was not large enough for everyone, without someone fetching a chair from another room, which Marcus did without being asked, dragging in the desk chair from the small study with the cheerful pragmatism that was his defining quality. Nobody made a speech. There was food. There was wine, which Seraphina did not have, but which she was glad other people were having. There was the kind of conversation that moves from one thing to another without a clear agenda, the way conversation moves when people are comfortable enough with each other to not perform the having of a good time, and just have it. Nora slept in the bedroom for most of it, and then woke partway through dessert and made her presence known through the monitor in a way that Seraphina had already learned to interpret with reasonable accuracy, and she excused herself and went in and picked her daughter up in the dark and stood there, rocking slightly, the sounds of the dinner at her back. She heard someone at the door of the nursery and turned. Adrian. He leaned in the doorway the way he had started leaning in doorways over the past few weeks, the comfortable, unpressured lean of someone who was present without requiring anything from the fact of his presence. He had been doing that, being present without requiring things. She had noticed it each time. She had not yet decided what to do with it, beyond noticing it and finding it consistently to be the right thing. "She okay?" he asked. "She's fine, she just likes company." He smiled, a small one. It changed his face in the way that smiles do. When someone doesn't use them as a default expression, they become more specific, more weighted, more true. "Smart kid," he said. Seraphina looked down at Nora, who was looking back at her with the alert, searching quality that had been present from the beginning, like a person who arrived already curious about where she'd ended up. "Yeah," Seraphina said. "She is." She stood in the dark nursery and held her daughter and listened to the dinner behind her and thought, without intending to, about the night she had come home to a house that smelled like the wrong perfume. She thought about standing in a doorway with her hand on her belly, understanding that what she had believed was true had become false. She thought about the wedding ring going onto the corner of the vanity table, which she had done very quietly, and which had taken her about 4 seconds, and which had been, in retrospect, the moment the rest of it became inevitable. She did not think about any of it with the sharp quality of things that still hurt. It was more like looking at a scar, the awareness of where it came from, the acknowledgement that it was there, and the specific bodily intelligence that says, healed, not gone, but healed. She would not say she was over it. She would not say she had forgiven everything, or that the account was settled, or that the damage had been repaired to original condition. None of those things were accurate, and she had not built her life on inaccurate assessments. What she would say, what she could say, standing in a nursery in Cambridge, holding a child who was 2 months old and already seemed to have opinions, was that the thing that had broken was not her. The marriage had broken. The trust had broken. The version of her life that had existed in the Calloway mansion, organized around a man whose world she had made the center of her own, that had broken. All of those things were real breakages, and they had cost her real things, and the cost had been genuinely high. But she was not broken. She had walked out of that house, and she had gone to work, and she had filed a complaint, and she had read the access logs, and she had met Leora Strand in a coffee shop in Somerville. And she had sat across from Victor Calloway in his office and declined to be afraid of him, And she had delivered a flash drive to a federal investigator at 7:50 in the evening, while 8 months pregnant, and she had given birth at 2:17 in the morning, and she was standing here now. Not triumphant, not undamaged, not a version of herself that had emerged from difficulty perfectly refined, every rough edge smoothed away by the narrative requirements of surviving something hard. Just herself, present, still here. Nora made a small sound, not distress, just the sound of someone who was comfortable and awake and processing the enormous project of being new to the world. Seraphina shifted her slightly in her arms and felt the baby settle against her chest with the trusting, utter relaxation of a person who has decided that the arms holding her are safe. "Okay," Seraphina said softly. "Okay." Dante came on a Tuesday 3 weeks later. He called first. He arrived at the time he said he would. He was in the clones he seemed to have shifted to. As a default now, she heard, through the removed channels that information travels through in a city where everyone is connected to everyone, that he had stepped back from the visible operations of what remained of the Calloway organization, that he was working with lawyers and financial specialists to restructure the legitimate interests, that he had moved out of the mansion into something considerably smaller on the other side of the city. She did not ask him about any of this directly. It was not her information to ask for. He sat in the chair in the living room and held Nora for 40 minutes. He held her with the careful, slightly stiff attention of someone who was very aware of how unfamiliar they were with the specific physics of a small baby, who was trying hard not to get it wrong, and who relaxed degree by degree as it became apparent that Nora was not going to require anything from him that he couldn't figure out. Nora looked at him. He looked at her. Something happened between them that Seraphina watched from across the room, quietly, not wanting to interrupt it, the particular gravity of two people discovering each other for the first time, the slow resolution of a stranger into a specific, irreplaceable person. When he handed Nora back, his face was arranged in the careful way of someone who is not going to show you what is happening inside it, which she recognized because it was the same arrangement she used herself when she didn't want to be read. She had not thought until that moment about how much they were alike in that specific way. He stopped. "I know," Seraphina said. He stood up. He put his jacket on. He looked at Seraphina for a moment, the long, specific look of a man saying something he has no language for. "I'm sorry," he said, "not for any one thing specifically. For the shape of everything." She looked at him. "I know you are." He left. She stood at the window and watched him get into the car, the plain sedan, not one of the Calloway vehicles, and watched the car pull away and turn the corner and disappear. She had expected to feel something more complicated than what she felt, which was simply the clean, uncomplicated acknowledgement of an ending that had been a long time arriving. Not sad, not relieved, not anything that required additional processing. Just done, over. True, she turned from the window. Nora was on the play mat on the floor, doing the focused, full-body work of discovering that her hands were connected to her and could be made to do things, which was apparently fascinating and required complete concentration. Seraphina sat on the floor beside her and watched. Outside, the city continued in its ordinary way. Indifferent and enormous and full of lives that had nothing to do with any of this, with Blackwater Harbor, or the Calloway name, or forged documents, or federal investigations, or a marriage that had ended in a doorway with a hand on a belly and the smell of the wrong perfume. Seraphina had once been afraid that without Dante's world, she would have nothing to stand on, that the infrastructure of who she was had become so entangled with the infrastructure of his life that removing him would leave her without ground under her feet. She had been wrong about that. The ground was hers. had always been hers. She'd built it herself, piece by piece, from a second-hand desk and 2 clients and 17 revisions of a business plan, and nobody's betrayal could retroactively unbuild it because it had never actually been dependent on them. She knew that now in her body in a way she hadn't known it before. Not as a statement she made to herself, but as a physical fact, like knowing where the floor is in a dark room. You don't have to think about it. You just know. Nora grabbed her own finger with her fist and stared at it with profound seriousness, as if this was the most important thing that had ever happened and deserved to be treated as such. Seraphina laughed. A small, genuine laugh, the kind that comes out before you decide to have it. "Yeah," she said, "that's yours." In an office across the city, in a building that was no longer quite his, Dante Calloway sat alone at a desk that had belonged to his father and looked at the window and did not call anyone. The organization that had defined everything, his inheritance, his identity, the architecture of his days, was being dismantled piece by piece, legally and without ceremony. The legitimate holdings were being restructured. The other parts were being allowed to find their own endings. The way things find their own endings when the authority that sustained them is removed. He had a lawyer. He had a financial advisor who was not his wife. He had a daughter he was learning to hold. He did not have Seraphina. He had understood, finally, what that cost, not as an abstraction, not as a regret, but as a specific, physical understanding of what it meant to be in a world that she was no longer in the center of. She had been, without his fully realizing it, the thing that made the rest of it make sense. The clear-eyed one. The one who told the truth about the numbers, and by extension about everything else, and whom he had chosen repeatedly not to listen to because listening would have required him to change something he didn't want to change. The consequence was the consequence. He had said that to himself. He would keep saying it until it settled into whatever part of him still needed to hear it. Outside the window, Boston was doing what Boston did in the winter gray and cold and completely unbothered by the personal devastation of anyone within its limits, moving through its ordinary life with the indifference of a very old city that had outlasted everything anyone had ever done inside it. He looked at his phone. He did not call her. He was learning what it meant to love someone without requiring their presence. It was harder than he'd expected, which meant he'd expected it to be easy, which told him something unflattering about who he'd been. He was working on who he was now. It was slow, unglamorous. The work of a person who has broken something irreplaceable and cannot repair it, and has to figure out what integrity looks like in the aftermath of that fact. He was doing it anyway, because Nora was 2 months old and would be able to read his face someday, and would be able to know someday the difference between a man who was genuinely trying to be better and a man who was performing the trying. And he wanted her to see the real thing. That was what he had. It was not nothing. In Cambridge, Seraphina put Nora to bed. She turned off the lamp in the nursery and stood for a moment in the dark, listening to her daughter breathe the small, steady, unhurried sound of a person who is safe and does not know it yet, who simply is safe, which amounts to the same thing. Then she walked out and pulled the door, mostly closed, and went back to the kitchen, where the light was on, and the kettle had just finished, and Adrian was at the table with 2 cups already poured, because he had been paying attention to how long things took and had timed it correctly, which was both a small thing, and she was increasingly understanding the specific way that care announces itself when it's real, rather than performed. She sat down. She picked up the cup. Outside, the city was cold and dark and enormous. Victor Calloway was awaiting trial. Martin Greaves was somewhere in another state, trying to rebuild a life from the parts that hadn't been required as payment. Riley had pled guilty. The Blackwater Harbor development was in receivership, its debt being managed by a court-appointed administrator, the legitimate investors being addressed one by one in the slow, impersonal machinery of financial restructuring that Seraphina had predicted, in writing, 8 months before any of it became necessary. She was not the one managing the restructuring. She had been asked. She had declined. She had given the name of 3 firms she respected and wished the process and gone back to her own clients, her own work, the thing she had built, and that was still standing. Whitlock Financial had lost 2 clients in the weeks when the civil complaint was pending, and the story was loudest. It had gained 4 others in the months after the indictment, when it became clear what her role in the investigation had been, and what the timeline showed about when she had documented her opposition to everything that went wrong. The financial advisory community, like all communities, ran on reputation, and her reputation had emerged from the noise with a specificity and substance it hadn't had before. Not because she'd gone looking for credit, because the paper trail existed, because she had filed the complaint before the crisis, because the warning letters were dated, because she had done the work correctly for 20 years, and that work was finally, entirely, its own evidence. She drank her tea. "She went down okay?" Adrian asked. She went down okay. She looked at him. He had, she thought, the face of a person who was trying not to hope for too much, which was a recognizable face. It was one she'd worn herself for a long time. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it. The house in Cambridge. Being outside the federal building." She paused. "Being at the hospital. You don't have to thank me for that. I know I don't have to. I'm doing it anyway." He looked at his cup. "I don't want you to feel like..." He stopped. Started again. "I'm not waiting for anything. I want to be clear about that. I'm not here because I'm expecting something in return for the last few months." "I know you're not," she said. "That's partly why I'm thanking you." He looked at her. She looked at him. Something moved between them that wasn't a decision and wasn't a declaration, something earlier than either of those things. Something that existed in the register of possibilities rather than plans. She was not ready. She knew that. She had a 2-month-old and a federal investigation she was still a witness to, and a firm she was rebuilding, and a marriage she was still, slowly, setting down piece by piece, the way you set down something heavy that you've been carrying so long you've stopped noticing its weight. She was not ready, and she did not need to be ready tonight, and there was something that felt like a gift in understanding that the night did not require anything of her except to be in it. She drank her tea. He drank his. Outside, the city was cold and dark, and neither of them was alone in it, and that was enough. It was, for now, more than enough. Somewhere across the city, in a building on Commonwealth Avenue, the lights in a particular office were off for the first time in 40 years. The desk was still there. The chairs were still there. The accumulated weight of 4 decades of decisions made in that room sat in the dark, unwitnessed and unresolved, waiting for the machinery of consequence to finish its long, impersonal work. And in a nursery in Cambridge, in a house that had no history yet, no accumulated weight, no 40 years of decisions, no debt to anything except the future, a child named Nora breathed in the dark with the steady, untroubled confidence of someone who had just arrived and had not yet been asked to be anything other than exactly what she was. The story did not end with justice, exactly. Justice was a process, and a process does not end. It continues, it adjusts, it reveals its limits and works within them. What ended was simpler and harder than justice. What ended was the part where Seraphina Whitlock was living inside someone else's story. The new one was hers. She had already begun it.